Of all military units in the Second World War, few were as infamous or as feared as the German Waffen-SS. Entirely separate from the regular German army or Wehrmacht, the SS, short for Schutzstaffel or Protection Force, were the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. Its members swore allegiance not to Germany or the German government, but directly to Adolf Hitler himself. First formed in 1925 as a personal bodyguard for Hitler, by 1939 the SS had grown into a powerful organization, 250,000 strong, divided into three branches. The Allgemein, or General SS, which ran the whole organization, as well as the Gestapo secret police, the Totenkopfbande, which ran the concentration camps, and then the Waffen-SS, the combat wing which fought alongside the regular armed forces. As the vanguards of the Nazi Party, the men of the SS were selected for their racial purity, physical prowess, and absolute devotion to Nazi ideology. As Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, explained, one basic principle must be the absolute rule for the SS man. We must be decent, loyal, and comradely to members of our own blood, and to nobody else. What happens to a Russian or to a Czech doesn't interest me in the slightest. Recruits' family trees were rigorously scrutinized for even a single drop of Jewish blood, and in the early days, even a single tooth filling could disqualify a candidate from serving. Though as the war ground on and the SS grew increasingly desperate for men, its standards would relax substantially, with even Muslim volunteers from the Balkans being allowed into its ranks. As soldiers, Waffen-SS troops underwent a brutal training regime to forge them into perfect warriors, tenacious, cunning, contemptuous of danger, and courageous to a fault. While this tenacity and zeal made the Waffen-SS a formidable fighting force, it often proved counterproductive, for instance, with their refusal to retreat in the face of battle, resulting in disproportionately high casualty rates. Their fanaticism also made them merciless towards their enemies, with Waffen-SS units committing countless atrocities against enemy prisoners and civilians over the course of the war, especially in Poland and the Soviet Union. One atrocity, committed in France in the summer of 1944, was so heinous that it shocked the SS and the Wehrmacht High Command to their core and prompted the Nazis to investigate their own men for war crimes. The town of Oradour-sur-Glane lies in the Haute-Vienne department of southern France, around 10 kilometers northwest of the famous pottery center of Limoges. A sleepy market village of less than 1,000 people, for most of the war the town was all but untouched, with life carrying on much as it had for hundreds of years. But all of that would change on the 10th of June 1944. 4 days earlier, on the 6th of June, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy as part of Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Prior to the invasion, a massive Allied deception campaign called Operation Bodyguard had convinced the Germans that the actual landings would take place in the Pas-de-Calais, leading German commanders to station their units far away from the Normandy coast. Among these units was the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, which had recently been transferred from the eastern front to the southern French town of Valenciennes-d'Argens for refitting. Soon after the Overlord landings began, the division commander, SS Standenführer Sylvester Stadler, received orders to ready his troops for battle and prepare to make the 600-kilometer journey to Normandy to repel the invaders. On the 8th of June, the division headed north, a journey seriously hampered by the French resistance, who sabotaged rail lines and flat cars and felled trees across the roads. Then, on the morning of June the 10th, SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Deichmann, commander of the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment de Führer, was approached by officers of the Milice, the paramilitary wing of the French collaborationist Vichy regime. The officers told Deichmann that the night before, SS Sturmbannführer Helmut Kampf, commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, had been captured by the Marquis de Limaçon, a local French resistance group, and was being held in a nearby village. Enraged, Deichmann quickly assembled his men and set off to exact his revenge on the villagers. Brutal reprisals against civilians for sheltering and assisting partisans was official policy with the Nazis in its occupied territories. Exactly 2 years prior, following the assassination of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich by Czech agents trained and equipped by the British, the nearby village of Lidice was liquidated by the SS, with 340 of its residents being either shot in place or sent to extermination camps, and the town itself was razed and erased from all maps. Oradour-sur-Glane was not even the only reprisal committed by the Das Reich division that month. On June the 8th, resistance fighters captured the town of Toul, only for it to be retaken the next day by the 2nd SS Reconnaissance Battalion, who proceeded to hang 99 villagers. On the 10th of June, SS soldiers were fired upon from the church tower while passing through the town of Marcellat, leading to 27 villagers being executed. But the massacre in Oradour-sur-Glane that was about to unfold was by far the largest, most methodical methodical and most brutal ever to be committed on French soil in the entirety of the Second World War. Nobody knows exactly why Adolf Deichmann chose Oradour-sur-Glane for liquidation, as it had never been a major center of resistance activity. The best explanation historians have been able to come up with is that Deichmann mistook it for the nearby village of Oradour-sur-Vez, error that was to have horrific consequences. Whatever Deichmann's reasoning, by 2 p.m. the Der Führer battalion arrived in Oradour-sur-Glane and began setting up roadblocks on all roads leading into and out of the village, sealing its residents and 6 outsiders who happened to be bicycling through inside. The villagers, many of whom were in the middle of their midday meal, were confused by the sudden invasion, but as the Germans had hardly bothered them before, few panicked or attempted to flee. Once the village was sealed off, Deichmann made his way to the town hall and informed the mayor, Jean de Certeau, that he was conducting a check of identity cards and that the villagers were to assemble in the main square. At de Certeau's instructions, the town crier, Jean de Pierrefiche, set off around town with an SS trooper beating his drum and calling for the villagers to follow Deichmann's orders. Nobody was exempted. The head teacher at the girls' school, André Benet, was dragged from her sickbed with a high fever and forced into the main square in a nightgown. Another man, Clément Broussardier, was dragged from the barber's chair in the middle of a haircut. When he tried to collect his bicycle, he was ominously informed, "You won't be needing it anymore." Despite Deichmann's claims, none of the villagers' identity cards were ever examined. Instead, once everyone was assembled in the square, Deichmann informed the villagers that he was conducting a search for resistance weapons caches. Deichmann then asked Mayor de Certeau to select 30 villagers to hold as hostages, who would then be traded for the captive Helmut Kampf. When de Certeau refused, telling Deichmann that he would have to choose himself, Deichmann ordered that the men be separated from the women and children and the latter be taken to the village church. The men were then divided into 6 groups and marched out to various sheds and barns scattered around the town. While most of the villagers cooperated with the Germans, a handful chose to flee as soon as they arrived. Among these was Marshal Broussard, who took a circuitous route out of the village to avoid being seen by the approaching troops. At one point, Broussard crossed paths with the mayor, who asked him where he was going. When Broussard explained that he was trying to run and hide, the mayor laughed and told him, "You can come and tell me tomorrow where your hideout is." It was the last time he would see the mayor alive. Others who refused to comply included Jacqueline Francine and André Pinade, the children of a Jewish couple who hid at their home while their parents went to the village square to be counted. There was also Paul Dutré, a 21-year-old who hid at home, and Roger Godfrin, an 8-year-old schoolboy who leaped from his school window. Godfrin was immediately spotted and shot by a soldier, but fell down as if dead and lay still even as the soldier approached his body and kicked him in the kidneys. Once the soldier had gone, Godfrin leapt up and fled into a nearby field. In total, around 20 villagers escaped in this manner, but the vast majority would not be so lucky. By 4 p.m., all of the men had been herded into the barns and sheds. One among them, German speaker Joseph Bergman, overheard the soldiers talking and whispered to his comrades they were about to be shot. But as they were surrounded by German machine guns, there was nothing they could do. Suddenly, at a prearranged signal, a pistol shot, the shooting began. The SS troops aimed for the men's legs, cutting them down before moving in to shoot or bayonet them in the back. Once the Germans were satisfied everyone was dead, they laid straw, wood, and other fuel atop the bodies and set the sheds alight. Though badly wounded, 6 men were still alive and able to move. Robert Herbraz, Marcel Darthaud, Yvon Roby, Clément Broussardier, Mathieu Barry, and Pierre-Henri Potron. Potron was the first to flee, but was immediately spotted and shot dead. The others, however, managed to escape and hid in a rabbit hutch until 7 that evening, when finally they were able to flee into the surrounding countryside. In all, 190 men died in the sheds and barns. Meanwhile, the women and children were led to the village church, the SS troops looting and desecrating the building before cramming their prisoners inside. 47-year-old Marguerite Reffanche, the only woman to survive, described what happened next. Around 4 p.m., a few soldiers brought into the nave, close to the choir, a large box from which hung strips which trailed to the ground. When the trailing strings were lit, the device suddenly exploded with a loud bang and gave off thick, black, suffocating smoke. Women and children, half choking and screaming in terror, rushed to those parts of the church where the air was still breathable. It was thus that the door to the sacristy was broken down under the irresistible pressure of a terrified crowd. I followed them and sat down on a step. My daughter joined me. The Germans saw that people had escaped into the room and cold-bloodedly shot down everyone who was hiding there. My daughter was killed where she stood by a shot fired from outside. I owe my life to closing my eyes and feigning death. Firing burst out into the church. Then the straw, firewood, and chairs were thrown in a heap onto the bodies lying on the flagstones. I had escaped the slaughter unwounded and took advantage of a cloud of smoke to hide behind the altar. In that part of the church, there were 3 windows. I went to the middle one, the biggest, and with the aid of the stool used to light the candles, tried to reach it. I don't know how, but my strength was multiplied. I heaved myself up to it as best I could and threw myself out of the opening that was offered to me by the already shattered window. I fell about 10 feet. When I looked up, I saw that I had been followed by a woman who was holding out her baby to me from the window. She fell down next to me, but the Germans, alerted by the child's cries, fired at us. The woman and the child were killed. I myself was wounded as I made my way to a nearby garden. I hid amongst some rows of peas and waited in terror for help to arrive. That was not until the following day, at about 5 p.m. In all, 248 women and 205 children perished in the burning church. Along with the men in the sheds, the total death toll was 642. That evening, the SS troops looted and partially razed the village before returning to their base, where Dykman delivered his report to Division Commander Stadler. Stadler's reaction, however, was not what Dykman expected. I'm extremely shocked by this report and shaken to the core. Dykman, this may cost you dearly. I'm going to ask the Division Court at once for a court-martial investigation against you. I cannot allow the regiment to be charged with something like this. News of the massacre soon reached the Vichy government and the SS and Army high commands, all of who agreed that Dykman had grossly exceeded his orders and called for his immediate court-martial. Indeed, no less a figure than Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, volunteered to preside over the trial. But it was not to be. On June the 29th, Adolf Dykman was killed by a shell splinter while fighting Allied forces near Neuers, and within a month, most of the SS men who had participated in the massacre were also dead. With no one left to try, the investigation was quietly dropped. The Oradour-sur-Glane massacre first came to the attention of the Allies, thanks to one Lieutenant Raymond Murphy, an American B-17 bomber navigator who had been shot down in April 1944 and was being sheltered by the resistance in the area. After witnessing the aftermath of the atrocity on August the 6th, Murphy was finally flown back to England, where on August the 15th he completed his final report, stating, "About 3 weeks ago, I saw a town within 4 hours bicycle ride up the Gerbeau farm of resistance leader Camille Gerbeau, where some 500 men, women and children had been murdered by the Germans. I saw one baby who had been crucified." The incident would not come to trial until January the 12th, 1953, when 65 of the surviving soldiers involved in the massacre were brought up on charges of war crimes in the French city of Bordeaux. However, the affair was to prove emblematic of the fractured nature of post-war France and Europe as a whole, failing to deliver any sort of satisfactory justice. For one thing, only 21 defendants were physically present at the trial, the rest having fled to communist East Germany or the British zone of occupation, where they could not be extradited. There was also the matter of 14 of the accused being from the region of Alsace-Lorraine. This region, which borders Germany and is home to many German-speaking residents, was annexed into the Third Reich following the armistice of 1940. The 14 Alsatian defendants claimed that they had been drafted into the SS against their will and should thus be exonerated of any crimes committed during the war. The final verdict, which found 20 men guilty, sentencing 2 to death and the rest to 10 years in prison or hard labor, caused an uproar across France, with left-wing politicians decrying the sentences as too lenient. Right-wing politicians said that they were too harsh, and Alsace-Lorraine called for the acquittal of its citizens. The pressure was so intense that only a week later, on February the 19th, the French government passed an amnesty law and the 14 Alsatian defendants were released. This, in turn, sparked outrage in Germany, which argued that if French SS members could be exonerated on grounds of involuntary conscription, then so should German members. Consequently, the remaining defendants were eventually pardoned, and by 1958, all 21 were free men. General Heinz Lammerding, the commander of the Das Reich division who had ordered the policy of retaliation against the French resistance, never stood trial, dying in 1971 following a successful entrepreneurial career in Dusseldorf. In the end, only one man was ever convicted for participating in the massacre, former SS platoon leader Heinz Barth, who was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1983, but released in 1997. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane still stand to this day, having been preserved on the orders of French President Charles de Gaulle as a memorial to the horrors of the German occupation. Everything has been left exactly as it was when the Germans marched out of the village, from sewing machines and other household items tossed out into the street during the looting to the burned-out remains of the church and Maire Desauteur's car. A museum housing personal items and testimony from villagers was dedicated in 1999, while the new village of Oradour-sur-Glane, population 3,000, was built nearby shortly after the war. While Oradour-sur-Glane was far from the largest massacre of civilians committed during the war, it nonetheless stands as a microcosm of the arbitrary brutality that characterized the deadliest conflict in human history. And of course, it is unique in being the only war crime so heinous that it shocked the Nazis themselves.
Hans, are we the baddies?
The laziest of dystopian fiction writers could not come up with a more stereotypical army of evil minions. A monolithic, pervasive, fanatical, ruthless force of crack fighters goose-stepping over Europe with skulls and lightning bolts emblazoned on their black uniforms. We are, of course, talking about the Schutzstaffel, better known as the SS, one of the paramilitary units to emerge from the ranks of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, one which eventually grew to become a parallel force within the armed forces, a state within the state, a horde of policemen, judges, and executioners responsible for the killings of millions of so-called undesirables. In today's video, we will find out how the SS were first created, how they evolved into Hitler's most trusted bodyguards, how they tricked and murdered their way into a position of extreme prominence within the Third Reich, and how they differentiated into several little-known and surprising enterprises during it all. The SA and the Stoßtrupp. The political party, colloquially known as the Nazis, was founded in January 1919 with the unassuming name the German Workers' Party. During its first rallies, discipline was maintained by loosely organized troops of stewards in charge of protecting party speakers and dejecting hecklers. The party grew in importance and visibility after hiring a certain Austrian painter as its propaganda specialist and rebranding itself as the National Socialist German Workers' Party in February 1920. When the artist formerly known as Corporal Hitler rose to the top position, he saw fit to reorganize the growing number of stewards into a formal paramilitary force. These were the Sturmabteilung, the Storm Detachment, or SA for short. Modeled after Mussolini's black shirts, these troops wore brown shirts instead and were led by Ernst Röhm, a former officer of the German stormtroopers during World War I. And just like their Italian counterpart, Röhm's brown shirts did not limit their operations to protecting party leaders. They actively attacked and disrupted other parties' activities, engaging in massive street brawls against the socialist and communist factions. But the brown shirts became too numerous, too powerful to be fully trusted by Hitler. Besides, Röhm and his acolytes did not hide their revolutionary and anti-capitalist feelings, which could alienate the early financial backers of the Nazis. This is why, in 1923, Hitler ordered the formation of a small personal bodyguard that would answer only to him. They were initially called the Stabsverheer, or Security Guard. The group was soon renamed Adolf Hitler Stoßtrupp, the Shock Troop, or as Hitler put it, the first group of toughs. This gang of toughs wore the same khaki uniforms as the SA, but they differentiated themselves by donning a black cap emblazoned with a skull and crossbones badge. This symbol clearly signified that these heavies meant business, but it was also a throwback to Imperial Germany's military tradition. The Death's Head, or Totenkopf, in fact, was a badge used by elite Hussar units. The first leader of the Stoßtrupp was Julius Schreck, a World War I veteran who also acted as Hitler's chauffeur. Schreck's small unit included a colourful cast of characters such as Ulrich Graf, a former butcher and amateur wrestler, or Emil Maurice, a convicted embezzler who would later serve as Hitler's secretary and even date the Führer's niece. The Stoßtrupp was the launchpad for top Nazi officials such as Rudolf Hess, or military officers like Joseph Sepp Dietrich, the most decorated German soldier of World War II. With the backing of the SA and the more elite Stoßtrupp, Hitler and his acolytes began planning a coup or putsch to take over Bavaria and later the whole of Germany. This was the infamous Munich Beer Hall Putsch of November the 8th, 1923. The first assault on Bavarian institutions on the night of the 8th went well enough for the conspirators. The morning after, Hitler and his chief ally, World War I hero General Ludendorff, marched towards the Bavarian War Ministry with the Stoßtrupp leading the vanguard. In Odeonsplatz, the rebels were met by 100 Bavarian policemen armed with a no-nonsense attitude and also guns. A firefight ensued with casualties on both sides. Hitler himself risked getting shot, but one of his loyal Stoßtruppen, Ulrich Graf, threw himself in front of the bullets. Presumably, he did this in slow motion while yelling, "Nine!" And so it was that Graf performed his duty, suffering heavy wounds to save the life of his party leader, who would later go on to make this sacrifice completely pointless by killing himself in the Führer bunker. Ungrateful of anything. The putsch overall had been a disaster, and Hitler was incarcerated. Whilst in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf and came to a key strategic decision. The National Socialist Party could not rise to power via an armed insurrection. He would rise to the top by exploiting the framework of democracy. But if peaceful means and respectability were the new fashion, well, what to do with the ever-growing ranks of the uncouth and brawling SA? The Führer only required a small force of elite bodyguards, but when he was released from prison in December 1924, the brown shirts had expanded to 30,000 men. The new direction in party strategy led to a rift with Ernst Röhm, who decided to emigrate to Bolivia in 1925. As per Herr Hitler, he ordered his old friend Julius Schreck to reassemble his personal guard, which had been disbanded following the failed putsch. The Praetorian unit was reassembled, albeit with a different name, the Schutzkommando or Protection Unit. After another name change to Sturmstaffel, Assault Squadron, they finally settled on Protection Squadron, or in German, Schutzstaffel. The SS were born. Early days of the SS. The official founding date of the SS was November the 9th, 1925, the second anniversary of the failed Munich coup. But Schreck had been recruiting members since at least September the 21st that year. Initially, the SS counted only 8 members, but following Schreck's September recruitment drive, each party district across Germany was asked to form a 10-man squad under one officer. The only exception was Berlin, where the local Nazis were allowed to recruit a 22-men unit. The purpose of the new SS was not only to protect the person of Adolf Hitler, but also to provide security to other Nazi officials and properties across the country. Despite the broadening scope of their activities, SS recruitment standards were always kept stringent. The ideal candidate had to be aged between 23 and 35 years old, tall, healthy, and strongly built. They had to be residents of the same area for at least 5 years with no criminal record, and their application had to be supported by 2 guarantors. Furthermore, SS guidelines excluded habitual drunkards, gossip mongers, and other delinquents. Every man was expected to adhere to the strictest discipline. Deviations from superiors' orders were punished with cash fines, removal of the coveted swastika armband, or even dismissal from service. Following acceptance into the protection squad, each man had to swear loyalty not only to the Nazi Party, but also to the person of Adolf Hitler. The Führer rewarded their loyalty by awarding the SS with a precious relic, a blood-stained swastika flag, a memento of the Munich coup. This caused the resentment of the SA, who felt that they had been a much more active part than the predecessors of the SS, the Stoßtruppe. But if the SS had the flag, the SA had, well, the SS. The new leader of the Brown Shirts, Franz Pfeffer von Solomon, in fact acted as commanding officer to Julius Schreck, head of the SS. Von Solomon asserted his dominance by employing SS troops in the districts as errand boys, performing administrative tasks for the party. In spite of this treatment, and in spite of Hitler's newfound desire for respectability, the SS occasionally found the occasion to prove their mettle in street battles. For example, in 1926, the 10-man squad in Dresden had successfully beaten off an attack of 50 communists against the local Nazi officers. In that year, SS leader, or Reichsführer, Julius Schreck, handed over the baton to former Stoßtrooper Joseph Berchtold. But the new Reichsführer did not tolerate interference from the SA and soon resigned in favor of his deputy, Erhard Haydn. Under Haydn, the Schutzstaffel underwent a period of decline, with its ranks shrinking from 1,000 to a mere 280 in the span of just 2 years. Moreover, some nasty rumors started circulating about Haydn. Apparently, his uniform had been customized by a Jewish tailor. When such allegations reached the ears of Hitler, he promptly dismissed Haydn. From here, on January the 5th, 1929, the position of Reichsführer was entrusted to Haydn's deputy, a former army officer, fertilizer salesman, and chicken farmer with outstanding managerial skills called Heinrich Himmler, who would soon take the SS from small ragtag group of men to one of the most powerful forces in all of Germany. The Himmler years. On this note, making good use of his organizational skills, Himmler revived the SS, bringing its numbers back up to 1,000 by December 1929 and then to 3,000 by the end of 1930. Ideal recruits under Himmler had to be over 5 foot 8 inches tall, or 1.73 meters. They had to look outwardly Aryan or Nordic and had to provide evidence of their ancestry going back to January 1800, with officers required to trace their lineage all the way back to 1750 to prove that they did not have any Jewish blood. Now, it should be noted here that much of Himmler's leadership and old guard did not fulfill this criteria, but the Reichsführer made an exception for those who had served in World War I. And what about the man himself, who hadn't actually served in the Great War and didn't meet his own criteria? Well, if you make the rules, you can apparently break the rules too. As for everyone else, after completing a rigorous selection and an extensive training program, it was time to swear a personal oath of allegiance to Hitler. It read, "I swear to thee, Adolf Hitler, loyalty and bravery. I vow to thee and to the superiors that you appoint obedience unto death. So help me God." New SS men then received a ceremonial dagger, which they paid for themselves. Under Himmler's direction, the SS increased in size and prestige, so much so that Hitler decided to make them independent from the SA. This was reflected by the uniform. SS men still wore the traditionally brown attire inherited from the SA, but Himmler personalized it by introducing a black kepi hat with the skull and crossbones and a black tie and a black crossbelt. The Reichsfuhrer also abandoned the old system of 10-man squads, each led by a district officer, and replaced it with a military hierarchy, albeit with distinctive ranks. For example, the equivalent of sergeant major in the SS was called Scharführer, or band leader. The captain was a Hauptsturmführer, or main assault leader, and so on. The year 1929 is remembered also for a major cataclysmic event: the Great Depression. The subsequent economic downturn led to a sharp increase in SA membership, as many unemployed workers joined the organization alongside a great number of ordinary criminals. As a consequence, discipline plummeted, and the number of violent incidents involving the brown shirts escalated out of control. At the same time, some factions within the SA vied for more power. They wanted to completely absorb the Reichswehr, the armed forces, or ally themselves with the communists. Needless to say, a confrontation within the Nazi Party was inevitable. And so it was that in the summer of 1930, the leader of the SA in Berlin, Walter Stenz, issued a series of demands to Hitler. He wanted his troopers to be presented as candidates for parliamentary elections, and he demanded that the SS be excluded from providing security at Nazi Party rallies. Upon Hitler's refusal, Stenz and his men attacked the Nazi headquarters in Berlin, clashing with the SS standing guard. Himmler's troops were heavily outnumbered, and eventually the brown shirts took over the party offices. Hitler recalled Rom from Bolivia, hoping that the old leader could restore order. But Stenz was out of control, going so far as to denounce Hitler and propaganda leader Joseph Goebbels for betraying Nazi ideals. The uprising was quelled only when the party expelled from their rank all SA units that had rebelled. This automatically deprived them of any funding. With the money gone, support for Stenz quickly evaporated. The SD. During this struggle, the SS had remained staunchly loyal to party leadership. Hitler thus entrusted Himmler with the task of rooting out any dissenting voices. The SS commander carried this out with the help of a new hire, a former Navy officer called Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich had been discharged from the Navy in April 1931 for conduct unbecoming of a gentleman. In brief, he had dated a girl for 6 months, but then married another lady. In May, he was interviewed by Himmler, who was looking for a security expert to set up an intelligence service within the SS. Heydrich, whose intelligence experience consisted of reading spy novels, nonetheless impressed Himmler, who hired him on the spot as the head of the security service. Heydrich created a system of index cards, filing personal details about any potential enemy of the party: communists, Catholics, Freemasons, Jews, aristocrats, conservatives, and Nazi Party members suspected of disloyalty or deemed unreliable due to debts or scandals. The following year, 1932, SS membership ballooned to 30,000. These troops now paraded around with their new dapper, infamous black uniforms, the ones commonly associated with the stereotypical image of the Nazi enforcers. Contrary to popular belief, these uniforms were not designed by Hugo Boss, but two SS members, Professor Karl Diebitsch and Walter Heck. Hugo Boss and later other clothing factories were simply contracted to manufacture the attire. In any event, by 1933, Walter Heck introduced another distinctive element: the two S's styled as lightning bolts, a design borrowed from old pagan runic script. Initially, the bolt insignia adorned only the lapels of Hitler's personal guard, but then they were extended to every unit. Rise to power. In January 1933, Hitler's long-term strategy to gain power via legitimate means, albeit with frequent beatings and harassment of the opposition, finally paid off. President Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor, or head of the government. 2 months later, the Nazis would win 288 seats in the Reichstag, the German parliament. The only problem was that the Reichstag wasn't really there any longer, as it had been burned down in a fire on the 27th of February. Apparently, the fire had been set by Marinus van der Lubbe, a Dutch communist, with strong suspicion that it may have been a Nazi false flag attack. Whoever was the actual culprit, Hitler took the occasion to pass an emergency decree providing sweeping police powers to the SS and the SA, tasked with protecting the state from its enemies. Brown shirts and black uniforms prowled the streets, rounding up thousands of political opponents. It was the first step in a hostile takeover of Germany and its institutions, a process in which the SS would play a pivotal role. Following the Enabling Act of March the 23rd, Hitler swept aside all political parties except his own, and leading Nazis were appointed in top positions throughout the country. One of them, Adolf Wagner, became Minister of the Interior for Bavaria, a move favoured by Himmler and his trusty master spy Heydrich. Overnight, the two top SS officers gained control of all police forces within Bavaria. This was Himmler's endgame: infiltrate all police and security forces in the Third Reich and eventually bring them under SS control. Bavaria was the first step. Here, the SS and regular police forces rounded up hundreds of socialists, trade unionists, Catholic activists, and other suspected enemies of the regime. Regular prisons could not hold them all, so Himmler and his acolytes had to get creative. The political prisoners were herded into a decommissioned munitions factory surrounded by a barbed wire fence. The location of the facility was Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp. Command of Dachau was handed over to SS officer Theodor Eick, who formed a new unit in charge of guarding the prisoners. This was the SS Totenkopfverbande, the Death's Head Unit, birth of the Gestapo. Following their success in Bavaria, Himmler and Heydrich sought to extend their grasp over the police force in Prussia, which implied control of the capital city, Berlin. The Prussian police was already rife with SA and SS men after all, but there was a snag. The Minister of the Interior for the Prussian state was top Nazi official Hermann Goering. He was too powerful, too close to Hitler to relinquish control of his security apparatus to those schemers in black uniforms. Most of all, Goering wanted to prevent the SS from infiltrating the political and intelligence functions of his police. On April 26, 1933, Goering merged these two functions into a new organization and assigned it command to a civil servant not affiliated to the Nazi Party. This man was called Rudolf Diels. He was the first head of the newly formed secret state police, in German the Geheimstaatspolizei, or Gestapo for short. Diels was a good cop. Perhaps too good. So good, in fact, that he had the audacity to begin arresting SS and SA men when their actions became too heavy-handed. Now, few liked the SA at this stage. They numbered in the millions, had anti-capitalist tendencies, and their leader, Ernst Röhm, sought to replace the regular armed forces. Goering in particular was wary of the SA gaining too much power in Prussia, and Diels' Gestapo was too small a force to effectively oppose them. In early 1934, Goering had to face another threat to the independence of the police within his jurisdiction. Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior for the entire Reich, wanted to absorb the Prussian police under a unified federal force. To protect his independence, Goering begrudgingly forced an alliance with Himmler. The Reichsführer SS would help Goering in keeping Frick at bay. In exchange, Goering had to dismiss Diels and hand over the Gestapo to the SS and Reinhard Heydrich in particular. The deal was sealed on April 20th, 1934. By controlling the SD, the Gestapo as well as the regular SS troops, Himmler now oversaw all secret and political policing activities within the German Reich. Night of the Long Knives. Himmler was clearly making big strides in consolidating the SS as the premier paramilitary arm of the Nazi Party, the chief enforcer of Nazi ideology and Aryan purity. There was one last obstacle to clear: the SA. Once the backbone of Nazi support, the khaki-clad troopers were living on borrowed time. As mentioned earlier, Röhm held ambitions for his brown shirts to completely replace the regular armed forces. This did not sit well with the generals, of course, nor did it sit well with Hitler, who needed the generals' support for his next power move, eliminating the position of president, thus concentrating all executive power within the hands of the chancellor, i.e. himself. This would have made him the unique, undisputed Führer of the Germans. Sure, Röhm had been a trusty ally in the early struggles for National Socialism, but he had grown too ambitious, too anti-capitalist. Furthermore, he was openly homosexual, as were several top SA officers. A regime built on manly traditional values could not abide such deviations from the norm. In February and March 1934, Röhm made it clear that he was angling for an appointment as Minister of War. Hitler did not immediately say no and met with him on June 2nd. At the meeting, Hitler convinced Röhm to take a month of leave during July. While the SA leader and most of his officers were chilling out, Himmler and Heydrich were scheming. They manufactured evidence incriminating Röhm of accepting French money to overthrow Hitler in an impending coup. The two SS officers compiled lists of SA men, political adversaries, and other targets suspected of disloyalty. Himmler then ordered his trusted officer, Sepp Dietrich, to assemble and arm two companies of men selected from the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the recently created elite unit of bodyguards to the Führer. Dietrich's companies were equipped by the regular army and dispatched to the town of Bad Wiessee in Bavaria. This was the beginning of the Purge that was codenamed Operation Hummingbird and better known as the Night of the Long Knives. The SS surrounded the hotel where Röhm and his lieutenants were enjoying their period of leave or indulging in a homosexual orgy, depending on versions. Hitler himself then traveled to Bad Wiessee to oversee the arrest of the SA leadership. Röhm and 6 of his officers were taken to Munich and imprisoned. The 6 were shot immediately in the prison's courtyard. Röhm's execution could have been avoided, as Hitler had second thoughts, but Himmler convinced him to go ahead with the order. The commander of Dachau, Theodor Eick, and his deputy, Marco Lippert, walked into Röhm's cell and shot him twice. With his last breath, the fallen SA leader muttered, mein Führer, to which Eick replied, "You should have thought of that before. Now it's too late." Meanwhile, all over Germany, SS men and Gestapo officers received the secret password Colibri, or hummingbird. As per instructions, they opened sealed envelopes containing the kill list of alleged conspirators to eliminate. Himmler's and Heydrich's best and brightest went on a 2-day assassination spree, targeting SA officers, old and current rivals of the Nazi cadres, as well as completely unrelated victims. For example, the music critic of a Munich newspaper, Mr. Wilhelm Schmidt, was abducted by the SS and returned to his widow in a casket with strict instructions not to open it. The unlucky critic had been the victim of an unfortunate typo, it appears. The SS were after one Wilhelm Schmidt with a T at the end, a general with the SA. Other notable victims included former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, shot in his home alongside his wife. Theodor Eicke took personal care of Gustav von Kahr, who had been head of the Bavarian government during the failed putsch of 1923. The 71-year-old was taken to Dachau, tortured, and hacked to death with a pickaxe. The purge did not spare Hitler's former Nazi Party comrade, deputy and rival Gregor Strasser. The Gestapo dragged him to a cellar in Berlin where he was shot from behind. The death was ruled a suicide. The entire operation had been a great success for Himmler and his acolytes. The Führer duly rewarded him with a decree dated July the 26th, which promoted the SS to the status of an independent organization within the Nazi Party. This promotion would allow Himmler to operate without any supervision and to fulfill his vision of turning the SS into the backbone of all police forces, as well as a parallel army loyal to the Nazi Party rather than to the German nation. Himmler's army. An army, by definition, requires weapons, but surprisingly, thus far, the only SS unit officially allowed to carry firearms were the bodyguards of Adolf Hitler. But this was not enough for Himmler. In September 1934, he wrested from War Minister von Blumberg the permission to create 3 regiments of armed SS troops. These were the Werfkunsttruppe, the disposition troops. They were called the SSVT for short. Establishing the SSVT required Himmler to create a training program and an officer academy called the Junkerschule. Officer candidates were selected amongst the SS and Gestapo and even what remained of the SA. Recruits had to comply with the usual racial purity standards required by Himmler and be at least 5 foot 10 inches or 1.78 meters tall. The curriculum included basic military training, advanced assault tactics, war games to learn the principles of strategy, as well as etiquette courses. Because by day you may be shooting unarmed prisoners in the back, but come dinner time you better use the right fork with the salad. Classroom training also included hours of political and ideological studies. Recruits had to study Mein Kampf and were indoctrinated on why the Aryans were the natural master race and thus entitled to, well, dump on everybody else. From 1938 onward, the SSVT trainees were allowed to practice their skills by staging large-scale training maneuvers with live ammunition and artillery. Before then, the main method to hone their battlefield prowess was through sport, and lots of it. For example, the SS practiced track and field, rowing, and boxing. A training manual at the time read, "Sport arouses belligerence, hardens the will, promotes self-discipline, and therefore promotes the training of the SS man to the level of a combat-effective fighter. In addition, it should also afford the SS man relaxation and rest and give him pleasure." At the end of the 5-month course, only 1/3 of the recruits made it to graduation. Those who qualified were inducted into the SSVT with one of the many pseudo-esoteric rituals loved by Himmler, an enthusiast of pagan and occult studies. These celebrations were often conducted at night with torches and searchlights illuminating SS insignia and other symbols inspired by Nordic lore. Other landmark events included the Winter Solstice celebration, which replaced the Christian Christmas, and the SS Irrwein, or marriage wine, a sort of pagan wedding ceremony invented by Himmler. These rituals had a powerful effect on the morale of SS troops, as it fostered a esprit de corps, a sense of belonging to a powerful, cohesive organization, somehow different and loftier than the average Huns in the street. Or, at least, that was Himmler's intentions. Even before his time, SS troops have been perpetuating another tradition which has done wonders to prop up the morale of armed units everywhere at any time, and that's drinking alcohol. The SS, alcohol, and sex. The SS, and the SA before them, had formalized their drinking binges into celebrations called fellowship evenings. According to Professor Edward Westerman of Texas A&M University, they promoted internal cohesion, expressed an exaggerated masculine identity, and fostered comradeship amongst perpetrators of mass murder. A fellowship evening usually started with a formal troop inspection, followed by a speech usually delivered by a World War I veteran. After singing Nazi Party songs, participants raised their tankards and beer flowed like there was no tomorrow. Fellowship evening became a staple among concentration camp guards before and during World War I. In fact, the inauguration of Dachau was celebrated with one such event. According to later testimony by camp survivors, drinking sprees went hand in hand with beatings and killings of prisoners as the guards competed to outdo each other. An Auschwitz survivor, Philip Müller, recalled how the SS threw a fellowship evening in honor of a comrade's promotion to sergeant. The merry companions drank and danced to folk music, one door away from a crematorium filled with bodies awaiting to be burned. A variation on the fellowship evenings were the Siegefahren, or victory celebrations, staged after conducting a mass killing of Jews, Roma, Slavs, or other undesirables. Here, SS troops from all ranks, including senior officers and Gestapo personnel, competed by out-drinking each other and boasting about the number of kills. It appears that both types of drinking rituals were not just meant to cement camaraderie or celebrate achievements, but also a coping mechanism for SS guards who witnessed and perpetrated acts of violence multiple times a day. In a speech in January 1942, Himmler himself acknowledged that the brutal camp duty could damage the character of his fine troops. Hence, it was important for them to indulge in alcohol to vent steam and maintain discipline. There was another way to avoid the stresses of mass murder, and that was, well, not committing mass murder. SS troops were clearly bound to obey superiors by their oath, but there were reported instances of SS soldiers who refused to participate in violence in the camps and asked to be relocated to frontline duties instead. On this one, those who refused to kill innocents were branded by their fellow troops as little mama's boys, or Schlapschwanz. That's German for limp, by the way. Clearly well-defined and overt masculine identity was of great importance to the SS. Troops were encouraged to marry perfect Aryan or Nordic women and breed numerous children for the benefit of the Reich as part of the eugenics program Lebensborn, or Front of Life, launched by Himmler in 1935. Now, we've done a full video on this before, but in short, the program sought out unmarried pregnant women of good racial stock, offering them support to raise their children, as well as trying to recruit others of good Aryan stock to come and be used as the female half of breeding pairs with SS members. During the course of the war, SS men were also encouraged to impregnate women in occupied territory, and their offspring were taken into care by the program. Furthermore, the SS perpetrated the kidnapping of many thousands of children from conquered lands to be raised as Germans in foster homes. The goal of Lebensborn was to curb the decrease in Aryan birth rates. Anything that contributed to that decline was to be actively opposed, which meant that homosexuality was also considered a particularly vile crime. In February of 1937, Himmler boasted to his generals that only 8 to 10 cases of homosexuality per year were recorded in the SS. He hoped to reduce the numbers even further by sending homosexual troops to concentration camps and having them shot while trying to escape. Himmler's estimates were far from accurate, however, as same-sex relationships among Nazi armed units were far more common than their leaders were willing to admit. In 1940, the SS internal courts debated 16 cases of homosexuality and 22 cases in the first quarter of 1943 alone. It appears that, out of all arrests from homosexuality carried out in the city of Dusseldorf, 57% involved an SS or SA trooper. As World War II progressed, Himmler spoke out about and against gay relationships more often than any other Nazi leader, advocating for the immediate execution of these degenerates. Only in 1945 did he soften his stance by proposing to have offenders sent to the front lines to prove themselves. Branching out. Speaking of spicy time, from 1939 to 1942, the SS ran a high-end brothel in Berlin, the Salon Kitty. This was the brainchild of Reinhard Heydrich and his head of counterintelligence, Walter Schellenberg. The original madam of the establishment, Kitty Schmidt, was arrested in June 1939 after smuggling money out of Germany and was offered a deal: either go to a concentration camp or allow the SS to take over. Schmidt complied, and Schellenberg installed dozens of microphones in the bedrooms. He then hired girls arrested by the Vice Squad and trained them on subtly extracting information from high-end clients during pillow talk. Thus, Heydrich and Schellenberg were able to collect confidential information about businessmen, Nazi cadres, and foreign diplomats. Notable clients of Salon Kitty included Galeazzo Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, and Mussolini's son-in-law. Heydrich himself was a regular patron, although he took care of having the microphones turned off during his liaisons. The SS differentiated into several other unconventional activities, normally not associated with a police and military force. For example, in 1936, Himmler and Professor Karl Diebitsch, designer of the infamous black SS uniform, acquired a porcelain factory to produce a profitable series of Aryan and Nazi-inspired knickknacks. Himmler eventually established the economic and administrative main office to manage all of the SS's for-profit enterprises, including the bottling and distribution of mineral water. And when I say for profit, I really mean it. The Reichsfuhrer SS employed almost exclusively slave labor from concentration camps, maximizing profit margins. Moving on from there, in July 1935, Himmler branched out into anthropological and archaeological research by founding the Ancestral Heritage Organization. This organization sought to confirm pseudoscientific notions about the superiority of the Aryan race by tracing its ancestral origins. From 1935 to 1935, these researchers conducted expeditions to Finland, Sweden, Italy, the Middle East, and Tibet, among others. Some of these expeditions were limited to studying and cataloguing ancient petroglyphs and folklore. Others sought to prove that the ancient Romans descended from a Nordic race or that the Buddha had Aryan heritage. An interesting aside here, their activities likely inspired the depiction of a cult-crazed Nazi seeking ancient artifacts in the Indiana Jones films. An SS officer called Otto Rahn did indeed conduct research on the Holy Grail in southern France, but he was never part of this group and was an outspoken opponent of Hitler's regime. Rahn eventually left the SS and suffered persecution from the Gestapo until his mysterious death in July 1939. During the war, the Ancestral Heritage Organization took on increasingly sinister tasks. For example, they provided infrastructure, funding, and materials to SS doctors at Dachau and other concentration camps to conduct medical experiments on unwilling subjects, which almost invariably resulted in their death. Unstoppable Himmler. Besides these interesting side gigs, Himmler's focus remained on expanding the SS's policing, intelligence, and military branches. By the end of 1935, his right-arm man Heydrich had expanded the Gestapo personnel from 35 to 607 agents who carried out 7,000 arrests in 1935 and 1936 alone. The secret police was an incredibly powerful tool in Hitler's hands to get rid of high-ranking opponents, including the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, General von Fritsch, and Minister of War, Marshal von Blumberg. Both top officers opposed Hitler's plans for an upcoming war to expand in Eastern Europe and would soon come to regret it. An informant of the Gestapo, one Otto Schmidt, reported that an officer called Fritsch had been involved in a homosexual affair. This turned out to be a completely different officer, but Himmler and Heydrich seized the occasion to have the general court-martialed. The subsequent trial recognized that there had been a case of mistaken identity, and Schmidt, the informant, was shot. Nonetheless, von Fritsch was dismissed from his position. As per von Blumberg, Heydrich came into possession of illicit photos of Blumberg's wife, proving that she was a former prostitute. Another sex scandal led to another dismissal. Thus, the armed forces had been effectively decapitated, and Hitler reorganized their leadership into the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, answerable only to him. As for Himmler, he was not content with overseeing a relatively small secret police force. In June 1936, the SS top dog pressured the German government for an appointment as a Minister of the Interior. The current minister, Wilhelm Frick, resisted pressure, but eventually conceded that Himmler be appointed chief of police. Whilst formerly subordinate to Frick, Himmler reported directly to Hitler. And more importantly, he was now at the head of all national and local police forces, including the criminal police, or Kripo, and the regular uniformed police, or ORPRO. In September 1939, Himmler consolidated all police forces, the Gestapo and his intelligence services, the SD, into a single organization, the Reich Security Head Office, or RSHA in its German acronym. It appears that 1936 was a momentous year for the Schutzstaffel. In the same year, Dachau commander Theodor Eich created a new infamous department, the SS Totenkopfverbande, or Death's Head Unit. Initially conceived to guard concentration camps, this unit grew to 8,000 troops by 1939 and was later used in military operations. Meanwhile, the military branch of the SS saw some expansion. In August 1938, the armed regiments of the SS-VT were expanded into a division-sized unit. This became the basis for the notorious Waffen-SS, the parallel armed force which fought alongside the regular army in World War II. The term Waffen simply means weapons or arms in German, by the way, which makes these the armed SS. Now, those of you who have a thing for internal structures may be wondering how Himmler actually organized his men, whose number ballooned to 250,000 by the start of the war. The SS were divided into three main branches. We have already covered two of them, the Waffen-SS and the RSHA, Heydrich's Reich Security Head Office. The third one was the Allgemeine SS, or General Purpose Branch, which oversaw a variety of activities and departments, such as the Economic and Administrative Office in charge of managing the slave labor force, or the Legal Department, which enforced discipline within the SS. The SS also had their own propaganda team, which edited and published the weekly paper Das Schwarze Korps, or the Black Corps. Another key department was the Race and Settlement Main Office, or RASHA, or RUSHA, which enforced racial laws amongst SS ranks and planned the settlement of ethnic Germans in occupied lands. Finally, they also conducted an educational program via the Adolf Hitler schools, 12 facilities which educated, or rather indoctrinated, boys and girls ages 14 to 18 on the tenets of Nazi ideology. The SS at war. As World War II erupted in September 1939, the most active branch was, of course, the Waffen-SS. Hitler's units would become a feared fighting force, regarded as elite by their foes. Interestingly, their baptism of fire in the invasion of Poland was far from a stellar performance, with regular Wehrmacht officers pointing out their poor training. The Wehrmacht also complained about the crimes of war perpetrated by SS soldiers in occupied territories, going so far as court-martialing them for shooting Polish prisoners of war. Himmler argued to Hitler that the poor performance was due to a lack of equipment and stifling supervision by the Wehrmacht. His complaints must have struck a chord, as the Führer allowed Himmler to set up his own military procurement office and military tribunals. Which is a good thing for the SS, as one of the roles of all SS units was the extermination of undesirables in occupied territories. The SS had played a key role in delineating the so-called final solution to the Jewish problem from the very start. It was the SD, or security service, who had orchestrated the Night of Broken Glass, the infamous pogrom of November the 9th, 1938. Then it was chiefly the SS who manned and coordinated the Einsatzgruppen, or operation groups, who carried out the Holocaust by bullets during the early phases of Operation Barbarossa. And it was Reinhard Heydrich who in January 1942 chaired the Wannsee Conference, during which Nazi leadership planned the systematic extermination of millions of Jews and other undesirables. After World War II, Waffen-SS veterans distanced themselves from the horrors of the Holocaust, claiming that these were perpetrated by units in the rear, such as the Totenkopf Division or concentration camp guards. In reality, the Waffen-SS were frequently rotated between frontline and rear duties, thereby implicating fighting units in the administration of the camps. In any event, by the late stages of the war, manpower shortages meant that Himmler could no longer be so picky about recruiting only Germans of pure Aryan stock for his SS. In fact, by 1945, the Waffen-SS was one of the most diverse formations of the war. The SS actively recruited volunteers and conscripts from occupied, allied, satellite, and even neutral countries. By April 1945, the Waffen-SS counted almost 830,000 troops. Of these, only about 40% were German nationals. A further 30% were ethnic Germans recruited from other countries, and the remaining 30% were volunteers and conscripts hailing from 17 different nationalities. The foreign troops made up 21 out of a total of 38 SS divisions. Notable examples include the Viking and Nordland divisions recruited in Scandinavia, the two Litischer divisions from Latvia, and the Charmaine division made up of French volunteers. These units were categorized as front-rank divisions, fully fitted and operational for frontline duties. Detachments of the Viking, Nordland, and Charmaine even fought in the bitter, desperate defense of Berlin against the Red Army. In most cases, however, foreign divisions were categorized as being second rank or even phantom. This meant that they were never fully equipped and were mainly used in the rear, generally in an anti-partisan capacity. The SS after the war: Odessa and Haag. Despite Himmler's best or worst efforts, the SS and the German military as a whole were doomed to lose the war. Heinrich Himmler himself was captured by the Allies and committed suicide on the 23rd of May 1945. The horrors of the crimes committed by his troops would soon be revealed to the world as Nazi officials and SS personnel went on trial at Nuremberg. Several secret organizations sprung up designed to help Nazi leaders escape the Allies and relocate abroad, mainly in Spain or South America. One of these was the Organization of Former SS Members, known by its German acronym of Odessa. Odessa was set up in 1946. The following year, camp survivors and notorious hunter of war criminals Simon Wiesenthal learns about its existence. Odessa had created a vast, reliable network of escape routes for wanted criminals. Usually, former SS officers would cross the border with Switzerland and then proceed further south into Italy. Here, they found refuge with the so-called monastery route, a network of convents, monasteries, and other religious institutions which provided cover to the fugitives. High-ranking Vatican officials played an active part in aiding Odessa escapees. For example, Austrian Bishop Alois Hodal, based in Rome, assisted former SS officers by providing them with temporary accommodation and travel documents. The Archbishop of Genoa also helped smuggle war criminals to Argentina with the help of a former fascist officer. SS fugitives had another ally amongst, well, the Allies. Immediately after the end of World War II, Western powers prepared for a possible confrontation with the Soviet Union and its satellite states. The West knew little about the Red Army, its doctrine, strategy, and tactics, but saw former Nazis as experts. That is why the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps contributed to smuggling to safety wanted criminals such as former SS captain Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. Odessa ceased its operations in 1952 and was replaced by another organization called Comrade Workshop. Instead of spiriting former SS personnel out of Germany, this outfit was focused on keeping hidden and funding those who had already escaped abroad. The early 1950s saw the emergence of another organization related to former SS men. This was the Mutual Aid Organization for soldiers of the former Waffen-SS, or HAG, founded by former General Otto Kamm. By October 1951, the association could boast 376 local branches and 2 newspapers, which advocated for Waffen-SS veterans to be granted civil and political equality with veterans of the regular Wehrmacht. HAG representatives campaigned for the release of thousands of POWs still in Allied captivity. Most of all, they aimed to rehabilitate the reputation of the armed SS, claiming that they were merely a frontline fighting force whose actions were unrelated to the crimes committed by the RSHA, the Einsatzgruppen, and the concentration camp administration. While this may have been true for many of the elite fighting units, this was not always the case. To name but a few examples, Waffen-SS units took part in the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto and provided guard personnel for Dachau, Malhausen, and Ravensbrück, among other camps. Nonetheless, Haig's lobbying activity struck a chord with the Western powers as the Cold War risked heating up and the rearmament of West Germany became a necessity. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, surely not a fan of Nazi ideology, realized that he needed the support of veterans across all branches to train and rebuild the West German armed forces. That is why, in his parliamentary speech of August 30th, 1953, Adenauer extended a helping hand to Haig, proclaiming that the Waffen-SS personnel were simply drafted whether they wanted to be or not, and we must learn to distinguish between the Waffen-SS and the SS. His declaration, however, left the government unimpressed. Legally, the Waffen-SS had been a branch of the Nazi Party, and as such, they were not entitled to the same pension schemes as veterans of the Wehrmacht. The Haig continued to campaign throughout the 1950s, staging large rallies. These were nominally aimed at searching for missing comrades, but became an occasion for the revival of Nazi ideology, symbolism, and songs. This revivalism caused embarrassment to Haig leadership, who courted support from centre-right and even centre-left parties, promising the votes of up to 2 million members and sympathizers. These numbers were clearly inflated, as the total number of Waffen-SS members was around 250,000, of which no more than 20,000 ever joined the Haig. Nonetheless, in June 1961, the association eventually lobbied the German parliament into providing a military pension to former SS troops. Following this victory, the Haig was largely successful in portraying the Waffen-SS as a multinational anti-communist force, a sort of proto-NATO, which kept its hands clean from war crimes. Looming over the Saxon landscape, Castle Colditz is the very image of impregnability. Its solid stone walls 2 meters thick, the sheer cliffs on which it stands plunging 75 meters to the Mold River below. Built in 1506, the castle has been repurposed numerous times over the centuries, serving variously as a noble residence, a hunting lodge, a zoo, a mental hospital, and a tuberculosis sanatorium. But in 1939, Castle Colditz would be put to its most infamous use when it was converted by the Nazis into a prisoner of war camp. Known as Offizierslager 4C or Offlag 4C, the facility was built for the Luftwaffe as a special high-security camp to house the most troublesome, escape-prone Allied soldiers, including many who had participated in the famous Great Escape from the Stalag Luft 3 as depicted in the 1963 film. Heavily guarded and located 640 kilometers from any border, it was thought to be escape-proof. But as the characters in The Great Escape point out, this policy of putting all the rotten eggs in one basket simply served to concentrate the greatest escape artists in the Allied forces in one place, and over the course of the Second World War, Castle Colditz would play host to some of the most audacious escape attempts in history. These attempts varied wildly in scale and sophistication. Some simply faked physical or mental illness to be repatriated back home. Others hid during activities outside the castle walls and slipped away at night, such as French Lieutenant Alain de Rey, the first successful escapee from Colditz, Dutch Lieutenant Hans Larijf, who hid under a manhole cover during outdoor exercises, and British Lieutenant Airey Neave, who hid in a hole under the camp stage during a prisoner theatrical performance. On September the 8th, 1942, prisoners were ordered to pack up their excess belongings into crates to be placed into storage. Seeing an opportunity, British Flight Lieutenant Dominic Bruce, the smallest man in the camp, crammed himself into a Red Cross packing chest only 1 meter square. The box was left in an unguarded storeroom for the night, whereupon Bruce emerged and escaped out a window using a bedsheet rope, leaving a note on the crate that read, "The air in Colditz no longer pleases me, auf Wiedersehen." He was recaptured a week later, trying to stow away on a ship in Danzig. Earlier in 1940, Lieutenant Anthony Allen had himself sewn into a mattress that was being carried out of the camp for disposal. Once outside, he cut himself free and escaped while wearing a homemade Hitler Youth uniform. He made it as far as Vienna, even hitching a ride with an SS officer before running out of money, and hungry and exhausted, he turned himself in. Many prisoners mocked up German uniforms and other disguises as part of their escape attempts. In 1942, French Lieutenant André Perraudot discovered that he bore a striking resemblance to the camp's electrician, Willy Ponert, and decided to impersonate him. On December the 28th, his fellow French officers blew a fuse in their quarters. When Ponert was duly summoned, Perraudot donned an identical uniform and toolbox and attempted to walk out the front door. Unfortunately, the camp had recently implemented a policy of issuing special tokens to outside workers, and when Perraudot was unable to produce his, the game was up. An even more audacious attempt was made earlier on June 5, 1941, by French Lieutenant François Boulet, who attempted to walk out of the castle grounds dressed in full drag. He had almost reached the neighbouring town when he dropped his pocket watch, causing a nearby British prisoner to call out. But when Boulet failed to respond and started hurrying away, the German guards became suspicious and discovered the ploy. Other escapes required considerably more planning and coordination. A common practice at the camp was for various prisoners to become ghosts, pretending to escape but remaining hidden in the castle so they could secretly assist with real escapes. On one occasion, Dutch officers sculpted a pair of clay heads which, when dressed in officers' greatcoats, stood in for two prisoners during roll call, the other prisoners concealing the escapees as they crawled into a manhole in the castle yard. That night, the escapees emerged from the manhole and fled while the ghosts took their place, delaying discovery of their escape for as long as possible. Colditz also saw its share of traditional tunneling attempts, the largest of which was carried out by 9 French officers starting in 1940. The tunnel started at the castle's clock tower, whose central shaft extended down into the cellar. Due to previous escape attempts, all the doors to the tower had been bricked up, but it was still accessible from the attic, inadvertently creating an ideal secret area from which to stage the tunneling. From the cellar, the tunnel extended horizontally 4 meters until it hit impenetrable bedrock, then vertically towards the chapel floor 13 meters across the chapel, then down another 5 meters, then 44 meters outside the castle grounds. The tunnel was lit along its whole length by electric lamps wired into the chapel's power supply. Tunneling continued until 1942, when the Germans, who could hear the digging through the stone foundations, finally searched the clock tower and discovered the tunnelers. But it seems that it was the French who got the last laugh, for over the course of their 2 years of tunneling, the prisoners had managed to drink every bottle of wine in the cellar and replace their contents with urine. So numerous were the escape attempts that the camp guards even established an escape museum featuring many of the prisoners' ingenious devices. They also made prisoners reenact their escapes so photographs could be taken, which were frequently published in Das Abwehrblatt, a weekly magazine for POW camps. But as creative as these various attempts had been, they were all eclipsed in 1944 when a group of prisoners decided to build a fully functional glider in an attempt to fly away from Colditz. The audacious plan was conceived by British Lieutenant Tony Rolt, who discovered that the roof of the chapel was entirely hidden from all sentry posts and looked out over an open meadow across the River Mulde. This discovery came after the murder by the Gestapo of 50 escapees from Stalag Luft 3, in the wake of which the Allied High Command discouraged all further escape attempts. But Dick Howe, head of the escape committee, approved the glider project as a means of keeping the men occupied. The project was headed by Flight Lieutenants Bill Goldfinch and Jack Best, who discovered a copy of C.H. Latimer Needham's book Aircraft Design in the camp library that proved invaluable to the design process. Flight Lieutenant Lorne Welch, an engineer and glider pilot, provided additional aerodynamic and structural calculations. Construction was carried out in the chapel attic, with a false wall being constructed to hide the glider and the men's tools. As the guards were more accustomed to searching for tunnels, the builders were confident that they would not be discovered, but nonetheless a system of signals and an electric alarm system was established just in case. The glider's structure was built of floorboards, bed slats, and any other scraps of wood the men could get their hands on, covered in cotton blanket ticking. Grain from the men's rations was boiled into a starchy paste and painted on the cloth to seal it, while control cables were fashioned from electrical cables stolen from disused sections of the castle. Even the tools used to build the aircraft required incredible ingenuity to fashion, with saws being made of gramophone springs and window bars, wood panes from kitchen knives, and drill bits, glue, and other items obtained by bribing guards. The completed aircraft, dubbed the Colditz Cock, measured 6 meters long, with a wingspan of 10 meters, and could carry 2 men seated back to back. To launch the glider, the men planned to assemble a 30-meter ramp on the chapel roof using wooden tables, and used a winch system powered by a falling bathtub filled with concrete to accelerate it to 50 kilometers an hour. After cutting away the launch rope, the crew would glide some 200 meters across the river to the neighboring meadow and make their escape. While the flight was scheduled for the spring of 1944, by that time American forces had arrived in the area and the escape was called off, though the glider was kept on hand in case the castle's liberation was delayed and the prisoners had to send a message to the Americans. Only one photograph of the Colditz Cock exists, photographs taken by American newspaper correspondent Lee Carson on the day of the camp's liberation. Soon after, the castle fell under the control of the Soviet Red Army, and the ingenious glider was never seen again. Though the original Colditz-Cock never flew, recent experiments have proven that it would have worked. In 1999, Southdown Aviation Limited built a full-scale replica based on Bill Goldfinch's original blueprints, which was successfully flown at RAF Otterham on February 2, 2000 for a Channel 4 documentary. On March 17, 2012, another full-size replica, this time radio-controlled, was successfully flown off the chapel roof at Colditz Castle and made a perfect landing in the meadow across the river, fully validating the remarkable skill and ingenuity of the camp's prisoners. By the time Colditz was liberated by American troops on April 15, 1945, an estimated 36 prisoners had made home runs, making it all the way back to Allied lines. Incredibly, in the 6 years the camp was in operation, only one prisoner was killed while escaping: British Lieutenant Michael Sinclair, who in September 1944 was shot by a sentry while trying to climb over a barbed wire fence. But the hundreds of other failed escapes were not in vain. Allied aircrew swore an oath that, if captured, they would make every possible attempt to escape. The intent was not only to make it back home, but to harass the enemy and tie up troops and resources that would have been otherwise used on the front. Escape attempts also helped boost morale by keeping the prisoners occupied and staving off idleness and boredom, and in both these respects, the escapees of Colditz Castle and other POW camps did as much as any man to bring about Allied victory in the Second World War. On a cold February morning in 1942, the residents of the Canadian city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, awoke to discover that their worst nightmare had come true. It began at 6:30 a.m. as air raid sirens wailed and streetlights blinked out as a blackout rolled across the city. Aircraft droned overhead, and the dull roar of exploding bombs could be heard in all directions. At 7 o'clock, these were joined by the distant sounds of artillery and machine gun fire as frantic radio broadcasts announced that city militias were in full retreat, pulling back to a 3-kilometer perimeter around City Hall. By 9:30, it was all over. The mayor, premier, and lieutenant governor surrendered and were led into captivity. Over the radio, Erich von Nuremberg was announced as the new regional governor of the province. Troops in coal scuttle helmets and jackboots marched down Portage Avenue. Enemy tanks stood guard at every street corner, and the white, red, and black swastika flag flew over the legislature and City Hall. Winnipeg was now firmly in the hands of the Nazis. Now, if you don't ever remember hearing about Canada being invaded by Nazi Germany, don't worry, this wasn't something covered while you were sleeping through history class. The dramatic events of February the 19th, 1942 were in fact part of an elaborate propaganda exercise meant to shake Manitobans out of their wartime complacency. In the memories of many residents, it would go down in infamy as If Day. 1941 had not been a good year for the Allies. In June, the Greek island of Crete fell to the Germans, while from April to November, General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps besieged the British 8th Army in the Libyan port town of Tobruk. On June the 22nd, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, while on December the 7th, Imperial Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and began their sweeping invasion of Southeast Asia and islands of the Pacific. More than ever, the Allied war effort needed the full support of civilians back on the home front. In addition to serving in the military or working in factories producing war material, one way the average civilian could contribute to the cause was by purchasing war bonds, essentially a private loan made to the government, backed by the promise of a return on investment after the war. Yet despite the dire situation overseas, many Canadians, knowing they were unlikely to be attacked on their home soil, had become complacent and disconnected from the conflict. Consequently, the returns of earlier war bond drives had been relatively lackluster. So when the Second National Victory Loan Campaign was announced for February the 16th to March the 7th, 1942, a small group of citizens in the prairie city of Winnipeg hatched a dramatic plan to remind their fellow countrymen just what they were fighting for and what the price of defeat might be. If Day was the brainchild of Manitoba Victory Loan Committee members Henry E. Sellers, John Perrin, and George Waite. Waite, an actor, is thought to have first proposed the idea of reenacting a Nazi takeover of the city. Preparations for If Day were extensive and meticulous, involving over 3,500 troops from regular, reservist, and local militia units, as well as 40 members of the Young Men section of the Board of Trade dressed in Nazi uniforms borrowed from Hollywood. George Waite himself played a Gestapo agent. Special editions of the Winnipeg Tribune newspaper, renamed Das Winnipeger Lugenblatt, were produced with articles in German, and false Reichsmark banknotes and decrees from Gauleiter Nuremberg were printed for distribution. distribution. On the evening of February the 18th, as light snow fell gently on the city, the players quietly took their positions around Winnipeg and waited for the signal to strike. That signal came the next morning. At 5:30 a.m., a taxi carrying a radio DJ to work was stopped by a squad of German soldiers. 15 minutes later, the radio station was in German hands and propaganda broadcasts began to fill the airwaves. At 6:30, aircraft painted to look like German bombers began to roar overhead while anti-aircraft batteries fired blanks at them, and on frozen rivers throughout the city, charges of dynamite and coal dust were set off to simulate exploding bombs. Meanwhile, tanks painted with iron crosses trundled up Portage Avenue to secure major road and rail junctions, while special editions of the Winnipeg Free Press carried breathless headlines like "Bombs ravage Winnipeg as airport fight rages. Casualties are high during terror raids." Over the next 3 hours, militia units beat a well-coordinated retreat back to the city centre until at 9:30 they finally surrendered. Major John Queen, Premier John Bracken, Lieutenant Governor Roland McWilliams, and all the city aldermen were arrested and transported to a makeshift internment camp established at Lower Fort Garry, a historic fur trading post 30 kilometers north of the city. Then began the Reign of Terror. In the wake of Erich von Nuremberg's announcement as Gauleiter of the province, German troops raided the Great West Life Insurance Building cafeteria for food, roughed up newspaper vendors, boarded up schools and synagogues, suspended school, and burned books, all old copies already stated for the incinerator, of course, in front of the Carnegie Library. Portage Avenue was renamed Adolf Hitler Strasse and Winnipeg Himmlerstadt. By evening, a printed leaflet was circulated decreeing, among other things, no civilians will be permitted on the streets between 9:40 p.m. and daybreak. Every householder must provide billeting for 5 soldiers. All organizations of a military, semi-military, or fraternal nature are hereby disbanded and banned. Girl Guide, Boy Scout, and similar youth organizations will remain in existence, but under direction of the Gauleiter and storm troops. Each farmer must immediately report all stocks of grain and livestock, and no farm produce may be sold except through the office of the Commandant of Supplies in Winnipeg. All national emblems, excluding the swastika, must be immediately destroyed. The following offences will result in death without trial. 1. Attempting to organise resistance against the Army of Occupation. 2. Entering or leaving the province without permission. 3. Failure to report all goods possessed when ordered to do so. 4. Possession of firearms. The leaflet concluded with, "No one will act, speak, or think contrary to our decrees." At 5:30 that afternoon, the performances were finally brought to an end when 600 members of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and cloak manufacturers marched down Portage selling victory bonds to bystanders. While IF Day was intended to shock Manitobans out of their complacency, its organisers had wanted to avoid any incidents causing harm. Therefore, they took care to widely advertise the event well ahead of time. Even the special newspapers distributed during the exercise carried an above-banner disclaimer reading, "This did not take place, but it could happen here." But inevitably, many citizens did not get the memo, adding to the realism of the event. Among these was Alderman Colonel Dan McLean, who, upon seeing the men in Nazi uniforms storming into City Hall, fled and hid himself in an empty office. Despite these minor glitches, the impact of IF Day was undeniable, with the Manitoba Victory Loan Committee selling over $3 million in war bonds on the first day alone. By the time the campaign ended on March the 7th, 1 in 3 Manitobans had purchased war bonds, and the province had raised over $65 million, exceeding its quota of $45 million by nearly 45%. It is estimated that by the end of the war, victory loan sales had helped to offset nearly $12 of the $22 billion in government wartime expenditures. But IF Day's significance went far beyond its financial accomplishments. The events, broadcast in newsreels across the country, helped put Winnipeg on the map and inspire other cities to rally even more behind the war effort. The city of Vancouver would even borrow materials from Winnipeg to stage its own version of IF Day, and several American cities contacted the organizing committee for advice on staging similar events. And on May the 8th, 1945, as Canadians across the country celebrated the end of the war in Europe, the citizens of Winnipeg were perhaps more acutely aware than anyone of all they stood to lose had history gone just a little bit differently. In the early morning hours of May the 10th, 1940, soldiers manning the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael looked up at the sky and beheld an alarming sight. 9 strange, slender, winged aircraft descending silently towards them. Within seconds, the aircraft skidded to a halt and disgorged 54 highly trained German airborne troops onto the fort's grass roof. Little could the garrison have imagined it, but in less than half an hour, their fortress, the most modern and impregnable in the world, would be brought to its knees in one of the most daring and successful assaults of the Second World War. To understand the importance of Fortress Eben-Emael, we must first go back to the start of the First World War. The German Schleifen Plan called for the German army to outflank the French by passing through neutral Belgium. Though Belgium had extensive fortifications protecting strategically vital city of Liege, these were quickly pounded to rubble by heavy German siege guns, and the German army marched right through. Eager to avoid a repeat of 1914, after the war the nations bordering Germany built elaborate border fortifications, the most famous of which was the French Maginot Line. Between 1932 and 1935, Belgium spent over 24 million francs modernizing the Liege fortifications, making greater use of reinforced concrete and spacing the forts further apart to protect them from artillery. And the centerpiece of these modernization efforts was Fortress Eben-Emael. Fortress Eben-Emael sits on a diamond-shaped embankment around 1,000 meters long and 900 meters wide, bordered to the east and west by the Albert Canal and Greer River, and to the south by a 10-meter deep anti-tank ditch. Atop the fort sit 6 reinforced concrete artillery casemates, Maastricht 1 and 2 in the north, and Wies 1 and 2 in the south, armed with 75mm guns, and Canal 1 and 2 along the banks of the Albert Canal, armed with 60mm anti-tank guns. These were supplemented by 3 massive retractable rotating turrets, or cupolas, Cupole 1 and 2 armed with 75mm guns, and Cupole 120 armed with 120mm guns. Rounding out the fort's defenses were 3 more blockhouses, MI1 and MI2, armed with machine guns, and Block 1 at the entrance of the fort, armed with a machine gun, anti-tank gun, and a searchlight. These strongpoints were connected by 4.5 kilometers of underground tunnels built on 2 levels, an intermediate level for moving men and ammunition, and a lower level housing the barracks, kitchen, infirmary, and ammunition magazines. Garrisoned by around 500 men, with another 500 kept in reserve in the nearby village of Wonk, the French were positioned to protect the vital bridge crossings over the Albert Canal, and its batteries were integrated with those of neighboring forts, allowing them to provide mutual fire support in case of enemy attack. Given these formidable defenses, it is easier to see why Fortress Eben-Emael was considered virtually impregnable, and why it weighed so heavily on the minds of the German high command in the late 1930s. As with the Schleifen Plan of 1914, Full Gelb, or Case Yellow, Hitler's plan for invading Western Europe in 1940, called for the German army to outflank the Maginot Line by driving through Belgium and the lightly defended Ardennes Forest. But before this could happen, the army first had to cross the Albert Canal, which meant that Fortress Eben-Emael and its heavy guns would have to be silenced. But the more German planners examined the Belgian defenses, the more impossible the task appeared. Full Gelb seemed doomed to fail. Incredibly, the radical solution to the problem came all the way from the top, from Adolf Hitler himself. If Eben-Emael couldn't be taken from the ground, Hitler thought, then how about from the air? Though the tactic had first been demonstrated by the Soviet Union in 1934, the Germans were the first to make effective use of paratroops, or Fallschirmjäger, forming the world's first dedicated airborne unit, the 7th Flieger Division, in 1936, under the command of Generaloberst Kurt Student. On April 9, 1940, the Fallschirmjäger carried out the world's first aerial combat operations as part of the German invasion of Denmark and Norway, seizing key airfields and bridges at Masnedo, Aalborg, and Oslo. On October 27, 1939, Hitler summoned General Student to the Reich Chancellery and asked if it would be possible to take Fortress Eben-Emael by dropping paratroopers onto its roof. At first, Student was skeptical. Parachute technology at the time did not allow for precision landings and required the Fallschirmjäger's weapons and equipment be dropped separately in containers. By the time the scattered paratroops had regrouped and collected their equipment, they would have lost the vital element of surprise. And even if the attackers could be landed quickly in a small area, what could a handful of lightly armed paratroopers hope to accomplish against a fortress designed to withstand even the most powerful artillery? But as Student continued to ponder Hitler's question, he realized that Germany possessed 2 secret weapons that just might make this audacious plan feasible after all. The first of these weapons was the assault glider. The Treaty of Versailles, imposed upon Germany in 1919, forbade it from possessing an air force, so in order to continue training pilots, the German government embraced the sport of sailplane gliding, establishing hundreds of gliding schools and clubs around the country. Pilots trained in these establishments would form the nucleus of the new German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, when the Nazis came to power in 1933. In 1936, the German Research Institute for Sailplane Flight, or DFS, developed the DFS-230, the world's first combat glider. Towed into the air by a Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, the DFS-230 could glide silently for up to 12 miles and deliver 10 fully armed paratroopers directly onto their target with pinpoint accuracy. The second secret weapon in the German arsenal was the hollow or shaped charge. This consisted of a 50-kilogram explosive charge with a conical cavity lined with copper. When detonated, the explosive shaped the copper cone into a high-speed jet of molten metal that could punch through 25 inches of steel or concrete. Together with flamethrowers for taking out bunkers, the combination of glider-borne troops and hollow charges was the perfect recipe for defeating the world's mightiest fortress. Within days of his meeting with Hitler, Student assembled a crack team of 480 Fallschirmjäger designated Sturmabteilung Koch after their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Koch, and began intensive training preparations for the assault on the fortress. The plan relied on close coordination and split-second timing. The men of Sturmabteilung Koch would be divided into 4 groups, codenamed Steel, Concrete, Iron, and Granite. Steel, Concrete, and Iron would land first, capturing the canal bridges at Veldzelt, Fraunhofen, and Cannes, and preventing the defenders from blowing them up. Then the men of Granite would land atop the fortress itself and take out the blockhouses and cupolas so their guns could not be brought to bear on the occupied bridges. All 4 groups would then dig in and hold their objectives until relieved by German ground forces. Training began in November 1939 with Czech border fortifications standing in for the blockhouses of Eben and Mael. Such was the need for absolute secrecy that the paratroops were not even told what their target was and trained in plain uniforms without insignia. They were not even allowed to handle the top-secret hollow charges, practicing instead with concrete blocks fitted with handles. Meanwhile, the glider pilots practiced precision landing, and here they ran into a major problem. The gliders took too long to skid to a halt, greatly increasing the risk of a collision on the tiny fort roof. After a number of experiments, it was determined that wrapping barbed wire around the landing skid adequately shortened the landing distance. By early 1940, the training was complete, and the paratroops were moved to airfields close to the Belgian border, where they awaited the signal to attack. That signal came in the early hours of May 10, 1940. At 3:30 a.m., the men rose, donned their equipment, and climbed into their gliders. Less than an hour later, the Ju-52 towing aircraft roared down the runway and up into the morning twilight. As radio signals might have warned the enemy of attack, the transports were guided to their release points by a line of flares laid out on the ground below. But almost immediately, problems began to dog the mission. Due to a misunderstood signal, one glider was cast off too early, forcing it to make an emergency landing near Düren in Germany. At the same time, the glider carrying Lieutenant Rudolf Witzig, commander of Group Granite, broke its tow line and was forced to land near Cologne. This left Group Granite with only 9 out of 11 gliders and 54 out of 85 men with which to carry out its attack. Problems continued as several gliders strayed too much over the Dutch border and were fired upon by anti-aircraft guns. One glider had its control cables shot away, causing it to plunge 12 meters into the ground, injuring its pilot and several passengers. Nevertheless, at 5:20 a.m., Groups Steel, Concrete, and Iron landed at their respective bridges. The defenders at Veldzelt and Fraunhofen were taken completely by surprise and quickly overtaken, with the Fraunhofen bridge barely being saved from destruction by one Corporal Stenzel, who stormed into the bridge bunker and tore out the firing cables with his bare hands. Over at Cambridge, however, Group Iron was not so lucky. The moment the Belgian defenders spotted the gliders descending, they immediately blew up the bridge. Only minutes later, the 9 remaining gliders of Group Granite descended upon the grassy roof of Fort Eben and Mael. One member of the garrison, Private Antoine, later described the scene. As the morning began to dawn, we heard gliding noises in the air, but no engine noise. We immediately gave the alarm to the senior staff inside the fort. Then, without waiting for instructions from the inside, our senior sergeant gave the order to open fire. Flares sprayed from the 5 guns, but that was wasted effort. Several gliders actually came rushing down on us, and we were surrounded. One of them hit our machine gun with a glancing blow as it approached and knocked it over. It is impossible to describe what happened next in chronological order, as the attack took place simultaneously across the fortress, but it is possible to give a taste of the chaos that unfolded over the next several minutes. Among the first structures to be attacked were the Maastricht 1 and 2 blockhouses. After blowing through the observation cupolas atop the blockhouses with shaped charge mines, killing the gun crews inside, the Paras placed another mine below the guns, blowing them off their mounts and opening a hole large enough to crawl through. The Paras then entered the blockhouses and dropped grenades through the empty shafts, destroying the staircases and ammunition elevators. elevators. Meanwhile, other groups were busy trying to disable the massive gun cupolas. The armor of Couple 120 proved too thick for the mines to penetrate, but by a twist of fate, the guns and ammunition elevators malfunctioned and the turret was unable to fire. However, a rather unusual problem soon cropped up. A certain Private Schmidt had replaced the water in his canteen with schnapps and was now sitting drunkenly atop the still rotating turret, forcing his comrades to pull him down before stuffing the gun barrels with explosives and disabling them for good. Kapal Nord and Sud also proved impossible to penetrate, but the Paras managed to disable them by jamming the mechanism with a shaped charge and dropping grenades down the periscope hole. Across the fortress, other extraordinary events were taking place. Upon landing, Heiner Lange, the glider pilot who had knocked out the machine gun at the MI Nord blockhouse with his wing, rose from his cockpit brandishing a pistol and a knife. The sight of him so frightened the defenders that 16 of them immediately surrendered. The commander of Lange's assault group, Helmut Wenzel, then proceeded to blow a hole in the blockhouse and climb inside. There, in the smoky darkness, he heard a telephone ringing and picked it up. Hearing a voice frantically speaking on the other end, he announced in perfect French, "The Germans are here." A moment later, he heard the other man exclaim, "Mon Dieu, my God." And the Belgians had good reason to despair. Barely 20 minutes after landing, the men of Group Granite had successfully knocked out nearly every gun emplacement and entombed the garrison deep within the fort. At 5:42 a.m., a signal was sent out by radio. Objective achieved. Everything in order. Deep inside the fortress, the mood of the garrison could only be described as grim. Not only had they been taken completely by surprise, but their defense had been severely hampered by a series of poor command decisions, including that to garrison the fortress only with artillery troops. As it was thought impossible for infantry to penetrate the outer defenses of the fort, little effort was spent on defensive infantry training. Even more alarming, MI Sud, one of the two machine gun blockhouses intended to defend against infantry assault, was actually empty during the attack itself, its crew tied up dismantling a temporary command shed by the entrance as per regulations. The three gun cupolas were also not provided with anti-personnel canister shot, and the guns themselves could only be fired on the orders of the surrounding infantry divisions. Adding to the garrison's misery, the blast from a German explosive charge had caused barrels of calcium chloride used to clean the latrines to burst, filling the tunnels with chlorine gas and forcing the men to don their gas masks. Nonetheless, the commander of the fort, Major Jartrand, ordered a counterattack, and over the next 6 hours, the men of Group Granite were tied down, preventing a breakout by the garrison, sustaining many casualties in the process. Then, at noon, a single DF-230 glider descended onto the fort, and from it climbed none other than Lieutenant Witzig. Upon landing near Cologne, Witzig had flagged down a passing railroad official, commandeered his bicycle, and ridden to a nearby town, where he phoned Luftwaffe High Command and ordered a new Ju-52 to tow him back to the fort. Upon landing, Witzig immediately took command and rallied his men, pressing home the attack on the garrison and finally sealing them inside the fortress. But at that moment, surrounding Belgian forts began opening fire on Eben and Mail, raining over 400 shells down on the Paras in an effort to dislodge them. But the writing was already on the wall for Belgium. That evening, the 51st Armoured Engineered Battalion of the German 6th Army reached the banks of the Albert Canal and prepared to make the crossing. Before this could happen, however, the anti-tank guns of the Canal Nord and Canal Sud blockhouses had to be silenced. So, under the cover of darkness, Lieutenant Witzig and his men made their way to the top of the embankment and lowered explosive charges on ropes into the gun emplacements, destroying them and allowing the 51st to cross the next morning. Then, at noon on the 11th of May 1940, only 30 hours after the assault had begun, the garrison of Fortress Eben and Mail finally surrendered. Only 42 days later, the French government capitulated, making Hitler the master of Western Europe. The assault on Fortress Eben and Mail was one of the most extraordinary tactical coups of the Second World War and the ultimate demonstration of the German concept of blitzkrieg or lightning war. For their efforts, every man involved in the operation was personally awarded the Iron Cross or the Knight's Cross by Hitler himself. All that is, except Private Schmidt with his canteen of schnapps. But it would also be the beginning of the end, for never again would the vaunted Fallschirmjäger enjoy such success as a purely airborne force. On May the 20th, 1941, the Nazis launched Operation Mercury, the airborne invasion of the island of Crete, which, though ultimately successful, inflicted such high casualties among the airborne troops that thereafter they were forbidden from participating in large-scale operations. For the rest of the war, the Fallschirmjäger would largely be used as elite ground troops, serving with distinction in such actions as the Battle of Monte Cassino. It would also be one of the last times Hitler's intuition would serve him well, with a series of increasingly poor decisions pushing Germany further towards disaster and ultimate defeat. But if nothing else, the assault on Fortress Eben-Emael dramatically showed how even the strongest fortifications, when based on outdated concepts of warfare, are no match for modern tactics, confirming the old adage, generals always fight the last war. When the Nazis steamrolled into the Netherlands in May of 1940, Jannetje Johanna Hannie Schafts and Truus and Freddy Oversteegen were just 19, 16, and 14 years old respectively. As for the Oversteegen sisters, their mother, Trien, had left their father years before. Freddy states of this, "She was just fed up one day. We lived on a large ship in Haarlem, but my father never made any money and didn't pay anything for the barge. But it wasn't an ugly divorce or anything. He sang a French farewell song from the bow of the ship when we left. He loved us, but I didn't see him that often anymore after that." Immediately after the Nazis came to town, despite the risks, Freddy goes on, "During the war we had a Jewish couple living with us, which is why my sister and I knew a lot about what was going on. At the same time, their mother also had her daughters join in with her in the rather dangerous task of posting and distributing anti-Nazi and communist literature around town. Given their brazen activities, word soon got around to the resistance that the girls might be open to joining, with one Frans van der Wiel coming calling in 1941. Freddy states, "A man wearing a hat came to the door and asked my mother if he could ask us to join the resistance, and he did. She was okay with it." She also states her mother simply requested of them that no matter what the resistance asked them to do, to always stay human. Of the sisters' personal decision to join, Truus stated, "A war like this is a very raw experience. When I was biking, I saw Germans picking up innocent people from the streets, putting them against a wall and shooting them. I was forced to watch, which aroused such an enormous anger in me, such a disgust. You can have any political conviction or be totally against war, but at that moment, you are just a human being confronted with something very cruel. Shooting innocent people is murder. If you experience something like this, you'll find it justified that when people commit treason, such as exchanging a 4-year-old Jewish girl for 35 guilders, you act against it." Needless to say, they were all for it, though not quite realizing at that point everything they'd be asked to do. She states, "I thought we would be starting a kind of secret army. The man that came to our door said that we would get military training, and they did teach us a thing or two. Someone taught us to shoot, and we learned to march in the woods. There were about 7 of us then. Hannie wasn't part of the group yet, and we were the only girls. Indeed, in the beginning, because of their age and gender, the authorities paid little attention to them. Thus, they were natural message runners between resistance members, as well as ideally suited for smuggling and stealing identity papers to help various Jewish people escape. They also occasionally were tasked with transporting weapons and even helping escort Jews to hiding places, generally Jewish children, as they blended in with the girls well, and the authorities, on the whole, weren't suspicious of the young girls walking along with kids. Also, thanks to Freddy's ultra-youthful look, particularly when she did up her hair in pigtails, she was often used for reconnaissance missions, as nobody paid any attention to her. Things escalated from these sorts of tasks, however, with assignments such as helping to burn down various enemy installations. In these cases, the girls were sometimes tasked with flirting with any guards, while other resistance members slipped in and set the fires. In 1943, the sisters were joined by a third female member of their resistance cell, Henny Schaft, a woman who would go on to be one of the most famous Dutch resistance members in all of World War II, with her activities seeing her marked for death by Hitler himself. When the Nazis invaded, the then 19-year-old Hannie was studying international law and particularly human rights law at the University of Amsterdam. Unfortunately for her, she would soon be given the boot from university, owing to refusing to sign a declaration of allegiance to Germany, a requirement to remain a student, and something over 3/4 of the rest of the students did. As you might imagine, even if you knew nothing else about her but her choosing to study human rights law at school, and given the activities the Axis were getting up to in the country, she almost immediately joined the resistance. In the interim, since the start of the war and being assigned to the same resistance cell as Truus and Freddy, Hannie worked with the resistance in various capacities and on countless missions, even learning German to aid in her activities. Naturally, the 3 girls became fast friends and frequently teamed up for the remainder of the war, with their missions having been expanded to something few women in the resistance were tasked with, directly eliminating enemy targets. Their big advantage over their male compatriots was their age and gender, which allowed them to get close to enemy soldiers without garnering any suspicion. Thus, the girls were eventually trained with weapons and set to, as Freddy put it, liquidating the enemy. As for the number of people they killed, a question they were frequently asked, they never disclosed, with the sisters' stock answer to that question being, you never ask a soldier how many people he's killed. Perhaps their most famous method was flirting and convincing a mark to join one of them for a stroll. For example, in one instance, their target was an SS soldier who they scouted, and once he entered a restaurant to eat, a slightly drunk-acting Truss entered and struck up a conversation. At a certain point, she then suggestively asked if he'd like to go for a walk in the woods with her, a prospect he apparently eagerly accepted. Then they ran into someone, which was made to seem a coincidence, but he was one of ours, and that friend said to Truss, "Girl, you know you're not supposed to be here." They apologized, turned around, and walked away. And then shots were fired, so the man never knew what hit him. They had already dug the hole, but we weren't allowed to be there for that part. Beyond luring unsuspecting enemy soldiers and Dutch collaborators to their deaths, sometimes they just killed them outright. As Truss once stated, after watching horrified as a Dutch SS soldier grabbed a baby from the child's family and hit it against the wall, the father and sister had to watch. They were obviously hysterical. The child was dead. I pulled out a gun and shot him dead, right there and then. This wasn't an assignment, but I don't regret it. Other times, they would simply ride along on their bike, Truss on the front and Freddie on the back with a hidden gun. As they passed their mark, if no one was around, Freddie would pull out the gun and shoot him. After this, Truss would pedal off as fast as she could. Once out of sight, they were once again, to all the world, just a couple of young girls out for a bike ride. Other times, they'd just follow the mark home and then come a-knocking, again with their young, innocent look, helping to ensure their target's guard would be down when they'd kill them. Beyond this, the trio also took part in bombings and other sabotage efforts, reportedly only refusing one mission in which they were asked to kidnap the 3 children of Reich Commissioner and former Chancellor of Austria, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. The children were then to be used to get the commissioner to release certain prisoners in exchange for their safe return. If he refused, the children would be killed. Said Truss of their refusal to do this mission, "Resistance fighters do not kill children." As for Hanny, while the 2 young girls often went overlooked, she was not so lucky. Her bright red hair and the many missions she took part in made her stand out. The authorities soon caught on, and she was initially marked as the girl with the red hair. As the heat turned up on her and Hitler himself ordered efforts towards her capture ramped up, she began dyeing her hair black and changed her name. Unfortunately, her real name was accidentally revealed to an undercover Nazi operative working as a nurse. What followed from this was her family being detained, though eventually, when it became clear they didn't know where she was or anything about her activities, they were let go. The Axis got her in the end, however, when she was picked up at a random military checkpoint on March the 21st, 1945, having been caught with copies of the communist newspaper Wahrheit. She was subsequently tortured for a few weeks, but apparently never broke. Given the war was in its final stages, she may have survived if not for her bright red hair giving her away as it grew, and with no dye to keep the roots black. Once the Germans figured out who she was because of this, the then 24-year-old Hanny was slated to be immediately executed, a sentence that was carried out on the 17th of April 1945, a mere 18 days before the Germans withdrew from the Netherlands. Apparently defiant to the end, it is reported that when the 2 soldiers tasked with killing her shot her, she fell, but both had missed their mark for a killing shot. Her last words were reported to be mocking the soldiers, allegedly stating after the first volley, "Idiots, I shoot better." As for the sisters, they survived the war but suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, with Truss burying herself in art and Freddie stating she got quickly married and started a family as her way to cope. Her son, Remy, would state of this, "She shot people, but she hated it, and she hated herself for doing it." Freddie would also state, "I've shot them myself, and I've seen them fall. And what is inside us at such a moment? You want to help them get up." Truss added, "It was tragic and very difficult, and we cried about it afterwards. We did not feel it suited us. I wasn't born to kill. Do you know what that does to your soul? One loses everything. It poisons the beautiful things in life." In the end, both sisters lived to the ripe old age of 92, with Truss dying in June 2016 and Freddie following her in September 2018, the day before her 93rd birthday. If you'd like to read a lot more about this trio of badass ladies, you can find more in a friend of the Oversteegen sisters, Sophie Polderman's recent book, Seducing and Killing Nazis, Hanny, Truss and Freddie, Dutch resistance heroines of World War II.
Hiro Onoda is a Japanese citizen who originally worked at a Chinese trading company. When he was 20 years old, he was called to join the Japanese army. He promptly quit his job and headed off for training in Japan. At a certain point in his training, he was sent to Nakano School to be trained as an Imperial Army intelligence officer. In this specialized military intelligence training, he was taught methods of gathering intelligence and how to conduct guerrilla warfare. He was being groomed to go in behind enemy lines and be left with small pockets of soldiers to make life miserable for Japan's enemies and gather intelligence in the process. On December 26, 1944, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders from his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, were simple. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens will come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may have to live on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily. Onoda then linked up with Japanese soldiers already on the island. Shortly thereafter, the island was overrun by enemy troops when other officers that were already on the island refused to help fulfill part of the orders that Onoda was given to destroy the harbour and airfield, among other things. This made it easier for Allied forces to conquer the islands, landing on February 28, 1945. Shortly after the island was conquered, the remaining Japanese soldiers split up into small groups of 3 or 4 and headed into the jungle. Most of these small groups were quickly killed off. Onoda's group, though, consisting of himself, Yuichi Akatsu, Tsuyoshi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kozuka, were not. They continued to use guerrilla warfare tactics to harry the enemy troops as best they could, while strictly rationing supplies, including food and ammo, as well as supplementing their small rice rations with bananas, coconuts, and other food from the jungle. Occasionally, they'd also perform raids on local farms when they could manage it. In October 1945, after another cell had killed a cow from a local farm for food, they came across a leaflet from the local islanders to them saying, "The war ended on August the 15th. Come down from the mountains." The few remaining cells discussed this leaflet extensively, but they eventually decided that it was Allied propaganda trying to get them to give themselves up. They felt that there was no way Japan could have lost so quickly since the time when they were deployed. Indeed, this would seem strange to anyone who had no knowledge of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Also, one of the cells had been fired on a few days before, and they felt that this wouldn't have happened if the war was really over. Near the end of that same year, local islanders, fed up with being shot at and raided, got a Boeing B-17 to drop leaflets all over the jungle. These leaflets had the order to surrender printed on them from General Yamashita. The few remaining cells once again scrutinized their leaflets to try to determine their authenticity. In the end, the wording on the leaflet pertaining to the method with which they would get sent back to Japan seemed fishy to them, largely because the wording made it seem that Japan had lost, something they couldn't fathom, and which was a big problem in their willingness to accept the war ended. If Japan had won, then they would come and get them. Japan couldn't lose, so the war must still be going. So once again, they believed that it was the Allies, tired of successful guerrilla tactics, trying to trick them into surrender. When this didn't work, more leaflets were dropped with newspapers from Japan, photographs and letters from the soldiers' families. Delegates were even sent from Japan and went through the jungle speaking over loudspeakers, begging the soldiers to give themselves up. In every case the cells encountered, there was always something suspicious in their minds about the way it was done to cause them to believe it was an elaborate hoax by the Allied troops. Years passed in the jungle, with these 4 soldiers continuing to perform their sworn duty of harrying the enemy at every opportunity and gathering intelligence as best they could. At a certain point, when most everybody they saw was dressed in civilian clothing, they began thinking that this too was a ruse from the Allied forces to lull the Japanese guerrilla soldiers into a false sense of confidence. They considered the fact that every time they fired on these supposed civilians, shortly thereafter search parties would arrive hunting them. Over time, they had gradually let their solitude twist their minds into thinking everyone was an enemy, even their own fellow Japanese who would occasionally come to try and find them and get them to come home. These, in their minds, were Japanese prisoners forced to come and lure them away from the safety of the jungle. After about 5 years in the jungle, Akatsu decided he would surrender, but didn't tell the other 3 soldiers. So, in 1949, he slipped away from the others, and after 6 months alone in the jungle, was able to successfully surrender to what he thought were Allied troops. Because of this event, Onoda's cell became even more cautious and went into deeper hiding, and took fewer risks as they viewed Akatsu leaving as a security threat. What if he was captured, they thought. After about 5 years, another of the small group, Shimada, was killed in a skirmish on the beach of Gontin. Now there are only 2, Onoda and Kozuka. For about 17 more years, the two lived in the jungle, gathering intelligence as best they could and attacking what they thought were enemy troops whenever they could risk it. They were still convinced that eventually Japan would dispatch more troops, and they would then train those soldiers in guerrilla warfare and use the intelligence they had gathered to retake the island. After all, their orders were to stay put and do as they had done until their commanding officer came and got them, and their commanding officers had promised to do so, no matter what. In October 1972, after 27 years of hiding, Kazuka was killed during a fight with a Filipino patrol. The Japanese had long thought he had already died. They didn't think he could have survived so long in the jungle. But now, when they had Kazuka's body, they began thinking perhaps Onoda was also still alive, even though he had also long since been declared dead. The Japanese then sent a search party to try to find Onoda in the jungle. Unfortunately, he was too good at hiding. With 27 years of practice, they could not find him, and Onoda continued his mission. Finally, in 1974, a college student, Nario Suzuki, decided to travel the world. Among his list of things to do on his journey was find Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. He traveled to the island and trekked through the jungle for signs of Onoda. Shockingly, where literally thousands of others through the last 29 years had failed, Suzuki succeeded. He found Onoda's dwelling place and Onoda himself. He then proceeded to try to convince Onoda to come home with him. Onoda refused. His commanding officers had said they would return for him no matter what. He would not surrender, nor believe it was over, until they returned and ordered him to do so. At this point, he would not have been allowed to simply go home. He would be required to surrender and throw himself on the mercy of the enemy. Over the years, he'd become too successful at using the guerrilla tactics he'd mastered, killing 30 Filipinos and injuring 100 others, as well as destroying various crops and the like for almost 3 decades. Suzuki then traveled back to Japan with the news that he'd found Onoda. Major Taniguchi, now retired and working at a bookstore, was then brought back to the island and to Onoda to tell him that Japan had lost the war and he was to give up his weapons and surrender to the Filipinos. As you might expect, after living in the jungle, doing what he thought was his duty, helping Japan, now only turning out to be wasting 29 years of his life, and worse, killing and injuring innocent civilians, it came as a crushing blow to Onoda. He later stated, "We really lost the war? How could they have been so sloppy? Suddenly, everything went black. A storm raged inside me. I felt like a fool for having been so tense and cautious on the way here. Worse than that, what had I been doing for all these years?" Gradually, the storm subsided, and for the first time, I really understood. My 30 years as a guerrilla fighter for the Japanese army was abruptly finished. This was the end. I pulled back the bolt of my rifle and unloaded the bullets. I eased off the pack that I always carried with me and laid the gun on top of it. Would I really have no more use for this rifle that I had polished and cared for like a baby all these years? Or Kazuka's rifle, which I had hidden in a crevice in the rocks? Had the war really ended 30 years ago? If it had, what had Shimada and Kazuka died for? If what was happening was true, wouldn't it have been better if I had died with them? On March the 10th, 1975, at the age of 52, Onoda, in full uniform that was somehow still immaculately kept, marched out of the jungle and surrendered his samurai sword to the Philippine president, Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos, in a very unpopular move in the Philippines, but immensely celebrated in Japan, pardoned Onoda for his crimes, given that Onoda had thought he was still at war the entire time. Onoda temporarily returned to Japan, but was unhappy that many of the traditional Japanese virtues he cherished, such as patriotism, were virtually non-existent in the culture. Indeed, in his view, Japan now kowtowed to the rest of the world and had lost its pride and sense of itself. So he moved to Brazil and used his back pay to buy himself a ranch there, and he eventually married. However, after reading about a Japanese teenager who had murdered his own parents in 1980, Onoda became even more distressed at the state of his country and young people in Japan. He then returned to Japan in 1984, establishing a nature school for young people where he could teach them various survival techniques and teach them to be more independent and better Japanese citizens. Onoda ultimately lived to the ripe old age of 91, dying on January 16th, 2014. Whether it's flying tanks, literal bat bombs, surprisingly effective pigeon-guided missiles, chicken-heated nuclear weapons, or dogs that are trained to gruesomely take down tanks, humans have been using animals in war in a variety of bizarre ways. Today, we're here to talk about yet another seemingly absurd animal wartime event of the 20th century that actually turned out to be something of a revolution in warfare, and that would be the Parasheep. The actual innovation these parachuting sheep represented was the flying supply column. This was a revolutionary idea that involved supporting a ground-based force with planes laden with things like ammo, food, and water that would be dropped using parachutes. The idea was fully realized during World War II with the advent of mass-produced carrier planes and more sophisticated and reliable parachutes. However, the idea was explored by other nations prior to World War II, with one of the first to implement it being Italy during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Taking place between 1934 and 1936, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, occurring in the Horn of Africa, ended in the creation of the relatively short-lived Italian colony of Italian East Africa. During the conflict, a large force of Italian soldiers was tasked with crossing the Danakil Desert, located in what was then northeast Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. Largely considered one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, the Danakil Desert, or at least the 120 so miles of it the Italian army was scheduled to cross, represented an impractical barrier using classic supply line methods. Realizing that every additional pound of equipment each man had to carry would increase the odds of dehydration or heat stroke under the glare of the harsh oppressive sun, the decision was made for none of the soldiers in the Italian advance to carry a significant amount of food or water at all. Instead, it was agreed that a contingent of 25 specially chartered planes would support the advance from the air, dropping necessary supplies at set points. These supplies consisted of water, cooking materials that could be discarded or left behind after each use, more would be dropped later, and most unusual of all, live sheep. Exactly why the decision was made to drop live sheep instead of packaged and pre-prepared meat rations isn't entirely clear, with some opining that fickle Italian ground troops refused to eat the standard issue rations they were given, prompting the military to instead send them live animals to slaughter and eat fresh. It has also been speculated that the military wanted to keep morale as high as possible by supplying troops with fresh meat, while also using it as an excuse to test the effectiveness of experimental parachutes, a technology which at the time was still in its infancy. In total, it's reported that by the time the Italian advance had cleared the perilous desert, some 72 sheep and 2 live bulls were airdropped for the hungry troops waiting on the ground. While the animals were intended for slaughter, footage of the airdrops shows that the sheep, or at least the ones shown, survived their fall with no apparent injuries and were quickly herded together by the soldiers. While mostly a mildly amusing historical tidbit today, this wartime footnote was actually an important occurrence. The advance across the Danakil Desert demonstrated that it was now possible for armies to traverse even the most unforgiving terrain without the need to develop, maintain, or protect a supply line. This was a pretty major revolution in warfare at the time. As correctly predicted in the August 1938 edition of Click magazine concerning the innovative sheep airdrops, a flying supply column is an entirely new development in warfare, but it is one that will play a big role in future military maneuvers. The Battle of Normandy, also known as D-Day, started on June 6, 1944, and was the beginning of the major invasion of German-occupied Western Europe during World War II. But why was it called D-Day? You might at first be inclined to think the abbreviation is similar to V-Day, Victory Day. Indeed, one commonly touted explanation given for the meaning of D in D-Day is that it stands for Designated Day. Others claim it stands for Decision Day, Debarkation, or even Deliverance Day. Even General Dwight Eisenhower, or at least his assistant, weighed in when Eisenhower received a letter asking for an explanation of the meaning of D-Day. His executive assistant wrote back stating D-Day was a shortened version of Departed Day. Given Eisenhower helped plan it, that should mean case closed, right? It turns out most historians think not, and indeed the evidence at hand doesn't seem to support Eisenhower's, or perhaps just his assistant's, claim. Hints of the true meaning can be found long before World War II in a US Army field order dated September 7, 1918. The order stated that the First Army will attack at H hour on D-Day with the object of forcing the evacuation of the Simithil salient. In that context, and with numerous combat operations that followed over the years, D-Day referred to the day on which a combat attack would occur, with H-hour likewise referring to the hour when an attack is scheduled to happen. Thus, the D is just a placeholder or variable for the actual date, and probably originally was meant to stand for date or day, if anything, if the associated H-hour is any indication. The use of D-Day allows military personnel to easily plan for a combat mission ahead of time without knowing the exact date that it will occur. Given that the planning for the most famous of all D-Days in June of 1944 started way back in 1943, and due to external factors like optimal tides only a few days in a given month were suitable for the launch of the invasion, trying to fix a firm date in the planning process was pointless, even close to the time of the attack. In fact, the original date was June the 5th, but bad weather at the last minute forced a day delay. By simply assigning the attack to occur on D-Day, it solved the issue and had the side benefit of keeping the date of the attack a secret as long as possible, just one of the many methods of deception the military employed to try to confuse the German brass with regards to the pending invasion. As for handling the pre-D-Day preparations and the plan for after, adding a plus or minus sign and a number after the D was used. For example, D-1 would indicate the day before the operation occurring, while D+3 would mean 3 days after the operation. In this way, the plans could easily be overlaid onto a calendar when the military leadership decided on the day of the attack. If the day needed to be switched at the last minute, it was then also easy enough to calibrate the plan to the new date. As alluded to, the D-Day that occurred on June 6, 1944 was not the only D-Day during World War II, and it was certainly not the last, as this method for planning military operations continues to this day. Of course, because the D-Day at the Battle of Normandy was, and continues to be, the most famous of all given that designation, it seems unlikely in the foreseeable future that it will be usurped in people's minds when someone mentions D-Day, despite the military continuing to occasionally use this designation.
What would you do if you ever found a banknote on the streets and nobody was looking? Nothing too heavy, maybe a £5 or a £20 note or the equivalent dollar bills. I'd take it. Like, even a 20. I believe, and I'm not sure, my knowledge of the law is quite out of date, but I'm pretty sure, at least in British law, that if the situation was that the person wouldn't reasonably expect it to be returned, that then it's not illegal for you to take it, if that makes any sense. And I think if I lost a £20 note, like out of my wallet, just dropped it on the street, or it came out of a pocket, unless the person is standing right behind me, I wouldn't really have any expectation for them to somehow track me down. The correct answer is, of course, that you'd pick it up and hand it into your local police station. Oh. However, that's frankly ridiculous. Yes, it is. But let's be honest about this, or to put it another way, let's be dishonest about this. But when you consider the trip to the station, the hanging about, the paperwork, and the odds of ever getting it back in the right hands, you're far more likely to take one last sneaky look around and then pocket the note, chalking it up to an incredibly rare moment of good fortune. Yeah, honestly, it's absolutely right. Even if it was like a €100 note on the floor, and I knew that I had to pick it up, take it into a police station, fill out all of the forms, and go through all of that crazy. I once accidentally bought stolen goods. I can't tell you what a massive hassle this was. And I felt like a criminal. And it wasn't like I bought it at a dodgy boot fair for an outrageously good price. I just bought something off of eBay and it turned out to be stolen. It's a massive hassle. If that was the case, I would just leave it there and not touch it. Or if you're like my friend Matt, Danny's friend Matt, I love Danny's personal anecdotes, you could compromise and make a pledge to wait until you've collected £250 on the street before you hand it all in to the police station in one big lump sum. After 40 years on the planet, he's found £20 so far, so he's only got another £230 to go. It's a good plan. No, it's not. When he hands that in, who's it going to go to? Just like the police are going to have to work out the individual allocations for all. This makes no sense. But here's another question. What would you do if you woke up one morning to discover that the sky was raining banknotes? I don't know. I'd be fairly pleased. It may sound too far-fetched. There was that amazing viral video a few years back where the back came off like an armored car on the highway in the States, and money is flying everywhere and people are stopping and collecting it. Humans. But I would be right there. I'd be like, pull the over, get out, gather all the money. Because I'm a human and I love money.
And it's gone.
It may sound far-fetched to give any serious consideration, but it's something that very nearly happened over the landscape of Britain during the Second World War. And while the Nazis' dastardly plan changed course over the years, Operation Bernhard still ended up developing into a fascinating tale involving the greatest counterfeit scheme in history, a lake full of dumped notes, and a group of prisoners who miraculously avoided execution by Nazi soldiers who were following orders just a little too closely. It's a bit weird, isn't it? Normally the Nazis are like, no, I was just following the orders to kill all of the Jews. Therefore I am innocent. No! Back in 1939, it was Arthur Nebe, the head of the Central Criminal Investigation Department of Nazi Germany, who first dreamed up the plan of bombarding Britain with its own banknotes, or to be more precise, bomb Britain with fake British banknotes. It wasn't an entirely unique idea. In fact, both Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt had considered the strategy of producing counterfeit enemy currency, but their advisors at the time were strongly opposed to the move. I don't know, it seems like a pretty great idea, because if you dump enough of it, you're going to get hyperinflation. That's going to ruin an economy. It seems like an awesome idea. Yet it was a distinctly ambitious idea, tightly packed with more than a few bizarre ingredients. Nebe's original plan was to totally destabilize the British economy by producing £30 billion worth of fake British notes, which would be airdropped onto British soil by the Luftwaffe. The thinking behind the idea was that while some dutiful British citizens would hand in the fake money to the authorities, the majority of the population would pocket anything they found and pump it all into general circulation, effectively poisoning the British economy and bringing it to its knees through hyperinflation. Absolutely. I think this is why it will be so effective. Imagine just a bunch of money lands in your garden. You're gonna be like, well, that's mine, isn't it? I'm not entirely sure the reasoning stacks up. It's one thing to sneakily pick up a £5 note you find at a quiet bus stop on your way home from the chippy. It's quite another to run around the streets in full view of your proud country folk, blatantly pocketing the downpour of new free money that's raining down from the sky. Yeah, but it doesn't really matter, because everyone will be doing it. It'll be like, all right, Tom, how's it going? Yeah, get the money. Everyone will be doing it. It'll be fine. But whatever their reasoning, the Nazis were sticking to their plan, at least for now. It's worth noting that at this point, although the name Operation Bernhard is often associated with the first phase of the plan, that name would refer to a later revision of the idea. The first wild scheme went under the name Operation Andreas. Although Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, dismissed the idea as grotesque. Really, Goebbels? This is what you find to be like. Mr. Goebbels, we have a fantastic idea. What we want to do is get rid of all of the Jews by gassing them and burning them. And Goebbels is like, fantastic, this sounds like a fantastic idea. Very good, proceed. And then the same guy comes along later and is like, listen, Mr. Goebbels, what we want to do is dump a load of banknotes over Britain to hyperinflate and destabilize their economy, causing an economic crisis. And Goebbels is like, that's disgusting. It's like, all right, Goebbels, chill the out. However, Hitler officially gave it the thumbs up in late 1939. Hitler was up for anything. Kill the Jews. Sure. Hyperinflate the British economy. Sure. Hitler, right? It has to be said that the Brits were feeling a bit cocky about the security of their banknotes back then. The Bank of England felt that it would be impossible for anyone to copy their notes in such large quantities to such an expert degree. It's like, alright Britain, chill out, they weren't that good. I've seen the notes from back in the day. Which, looking back, is a bit surprising. I should read these scripts ahead of time. As the British banknotes were a bit rubbish. The design hadn't changed much since 1855, 100 years. I swear they change the notes like every 5 years now. We just now got all plastic notes. Although the notes contained serial numbers, watermarks, and 150 other minor marks, which were often assumed to be printing glitches but were actually security measures, the notes, however, were still quite technologically simple. The Nazis decided to focus their efforts on the white fiver, as this had the largest circulation. A forgery unit was set up in Berlin in 1940 under the daily operational control of mathematician and codebreaker Albert Langer. It feels like he was underutilized. He'd be like, what are we working on today? Well, we're going to make the Enigma machine. What are we doing today? We're going to copy some banknotes. I feel like my speciality was better suited to the Enigma machine. Get the fuck! I feel like there's something about angry Germans which just works better than any other nationality.
Der Angriff Steigers war ein Befehl! Verschickt sie! Dass ihr wagen, sie meinen Befehl zu widersetzen!
After 7 months of toiling over the production of identical handmade paper, preparing identical printing plates, and replicating British serial number system, the team finally had a forgery with which they were relatively happy with. The most difficult part was reproducing the vignette of the Britannia figure on the reverse side of the note, and not everyone was convinced that they got the eyes quite right. But the project was deemed good to go. Langer claimed that £3 million worth of fake fivers were produced during Operation Andreas, although expert historians claim that the figure was closer to about 500,000.
It's like, yeah, we definitely made £3 million worth. Everyone's like, no, you didn't. Don't gloat, Langer. We know you're lying.
Either way, it didn't matter as they were never used, and the fate of these notes is unknown. Following a reshuffling of duties, Langer was taken off the project and the whole idea was put on ice for a while. However, the scheme was revived in 1942 under the orders of Heinrich Himmler, who placed SS Major Bernhard Kruger in charge of the revised plan. There's our name. As you might be able to guess from the name, this is where Operation Bernhard goes into full swing. The premise of the plan was still very much rooted in the idea of producing tons and tons of counterfeit British money, but they'd now quietly moved on from the idea of dropping the forgeries from aircraft over the landscape of Britain like special wartime gift voucher bonds. I'd like to think that this was partly because they realized the idea was quite silly. I don't think it's a silly idea, Danny. I think this is a pretty epic idea. But the official reason was that the Luftwaffe had suffered heavy losses by this time, and they didn't have enough planes to piss about on this kind of stuff. Anyway, the Nazis had an easier and possibly more effective plan now. They would use the forgeries to finance their own dodgy money laundering schemes and under-the-counter intelligence operations. Hell, the money's fake. Can you imagine the German government prints fake British money, then goes to like an exchange office and be like, "Hi, I'd like to exchange this British money." In the middle of the war, be like, "How are you getting so much British money?" Questions would be asked. Bernhard assembled a team of 140 Jewish concentration camp prisoners, because of course he did, who had been handpicked for their skills in engraving, printing, and draftsmanship. Operations were set up in special work areas in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where the prisoners were to find life very different to what they had become accustomed. For starters, they were treated with unusual courtesy and respect from the Nazis, including Bernhard himself. They were given cigarettes, a radio, even rations. Oh my god, they got food! How generous, Nazis! And even had their own ping pong table on which they would play with the guards. This is all fantastic. It's wonderful. They get food and cigarettes and a ping pong table and absolutely no freedom and are forced to do labor. The prisoners strongly suspected that they would almost certainly be killed after the operation was complete to avoid any trace of evidence leading back to the forgery production. And they were right. That was exactly the plan. They found themselves facing a stark choice: work hard and fast to please their courteous captors, but accelerate the journey to their own graves, or try to drag out the project for as long as possible, but risk execution for sabotage. Fortunately, the second idea had some mileage. Bernhard was a mysterious figure, and it's not known for sure where he stood on the planned fate of his prisoners, but it's widely believed that he was silently complicit in the plan to stretch out the scheme for as long as possible, as he knew that he would be sent back to the front line as soon as the project was complete. You can just imagine this work environment. The Nazis are like, well, when we stop faking these notes, we're going to have to go fight in a horrible war. And the Jews are like, when we stop making these notes, you f***ers are going to kill us. So they'll be like, how about we just play some ping pong? Still, they couldn't just sit around and play ping pong all day. Why not? In fact, they were kept quite busy. Between 1942 and 1945, the prisoners forged about £132 million of fake British money in various denominations. To put that in perspective, that's over £5 billion in today's money. That's a lot of money. At the time, it was more notes than the Bank of England held in all of their reserve vaults, and it would have been equal to about 15% of all genuine British currency in circulation. Good lord. It certainly would have been enough to cast deep suspicion on every British banknote of the day. Exactly how much money was ever used by the Nazis may never be known. Some of it was poured into money laundering operations, while some was used to pay off spies. Most notably, it's believed that around £100,000 of it was used to acquire information to free the Italian leader Benito Mussolini. But by 1945, Nazis were still sitting on big old piles of forged notes and figuring out exactly what to do with them. I hope they had them in a giant room and they played with them, like Scrooge McDuck. But as I'm sure you've already worked out, it was just a tad too late. The end of the war was looming, and spoiler alert, the Nazis didn't win. As the Allied forces advanced on Germany, the Nazis closed down production of the counterfeit notes. They packed up their tools and transported all the prisoners' equipment and forged notes to Austria. As predicted, an order was given to execute Bernhard's team of prisoners as soon as they arrived at the Abensee concentration camp. However, the prisoners were split into 3 groups, and the truck transporting the final group to the camp broke down en route. The guards were forced to march this last group to the new camp on foot, which took 2 days. As the orders specifically stated, that the prisoners should be executed together, the guards already at the camp waited until the arrival of the final group, and this delay proved to be crucial. By the time the final group arrived, they found that the guards at the camp had released the prisoners and fled the camp in fear of the advancing Allied army. Shrugging their shoulders in defeat, the guards of the final group did the same thing, and the Americans liberated the Abensi camp the following day. The phrase, just following orders, is often used to lamely defend an act of atrocity, just as my example at the beginning of this video, but in this case, we should be thankful to the Nazi soldiers who were so determined to follow their orders to the letter. Thankful might be an overstatement there. So, what happened to all the forged notes? A lot of it was burned before the journey to Austria, but in a last act of desperation, all the rest was quickly dumped in Lake Toplitz in the Austrian Alps. Over the years, a few crates of these fake notes have been found during expeditions to uncover the lost Nazi gold. That sounds straight off, well, it would sound straight off the History Channel if it was like, a journey to uncover Nazi gold hidden in the pyramids by aliens. But it's still a mystery as to how much of it is lurking beneath the waters of Lake Toplitz. Of course, it's not really Nazi gold, and very probably not worth uncovering anyway. The Bank of England are unlikely to offer you an exchange in current currency if you wanted in one day with £150 million worth of these things. Although some of the found forgeries are still fetching pretty good prices on eBay. They wouldn't if all of the money was discovered. That would flood the market and destabilize it, like the economy. But considering the absurdity and the deviousness of the original plan to shower Britain with fake banknotes falling from the sky, it's perhaps fitting that most of the idea is now buried and probably lost forever at the bottom of a lake.
Gros Isle lies 50 kilometers east of Quebec City, one of 21 islands in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. Though its name means Big Island in French, Gros Isle is barely 2 kilometers square, home to a small collection of buildings from its days as a quarantine station for Irish immigrants arriving in Canada. Designated a National Historic Site in 1974, today the island is open to tourists and hosts a museum, guided walking tours, and other activities. Yet this seemingly idyllic little island holds a dark secret. During the Second World War, a team of Canadian scientists used Gros Isle as a secret laboratory to study and weaponize some of the deadliest diseases known to mankind. Biological weapons could have unleashed a bacteriological apocalypse. So what's the full story here? When one thinks of weapons of mass destruction, one is unlikely to think of Canada. Yet in the build-up to the Second World War, Canada was among the first Western nations to push for the development of chemical and biological warfare. And the unlikely champion of this initiative was a man more associated with saving millions of lives than ending them, Sir Frederick Banting. In 1923, Banting was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine for the discovery of insulin, used in the treatment of diabetes. Warily observing the rise of Nazism and Europe's steady march towards war, in the late 1930s, Banting became gravely concerned about Germany's potential use of chemical and germ warfare in the coming conflict. Germany had pioneered chemical warfare during the First World War, first deploying chlorine gas against Canadian and French troops at the Battle of Presse in April of 1915, and its microbiologists were among the finest in the world. Around 1.3 million casualties, including 90,000 deaths, were inflicted by poison gas during the conflict. Newer, more potent gases developed since then had the potential to kill millions more, and biological weapons even more than that. So obsessed was Banting with halting the Nazi war machine that in 1939 he wrote in his diary, "We need to kill 2 or 4 million young Germans without mercy, without feeling. It is our duty to eliminate them." The Nazis and him apparently would have gotten along swimmingly if he'd just been German instead of Canadian. In any event, soon after Germany's invasion of Poland in September of 1939, Banting met with senior government officials and convinced them to back a more intensive chemical and biological weapons program. Limited research on bacteriological warfare agents was already underway in Canadian universities since 1937, but these programs were severely underfunded. Turning to the private sector, Banting managed to secure $500,000, an unprecedented amount in those days, from Samuel Bronfman, head of the surgery's distillery, and John David Eaton, owner of Eaton's department stores. With this infusion of cash, bioweapons research in Canada kicked into high gear, and a special body known as the M1000 Committee was formed to direct it. But Banting would not live to see the fruits of his initiative, dying in a plane crash in Newfoundland in February of 1941 while flying to meet with British biological weapons experts. In December of 1941, the project took on a new urgency as Japan entered the war on the side of the Axis. Japan was even more advanced in its use of biological warfare, having established the infamous Unit 731 in occupied Manchuria to test biological weapons on live Chinese POWs and civilians, the test subjects often being dissected alive without anesthesia. The Japanese also deployed anthrax, cholera, and bubonic plague against the Chinese villagers, killing over 400,000 civilians in this way. The M1000 committee considered dozens of potential bacteriological warfare agents for development, including bubonic plague, typhus, tularemia, psittacosis, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, botulism, salmonella, glanders, and African horse sickness. But early on, two clear frontrunners emerged: rinderpest, a disease mainly affecting cattle, and anthrax. Anthrax was particularly well suited to biological warfare as it formed hard, resilient spores which could resist extremely high temperatures. This allowed anthrax spores to be packed into airdrop bombs and dispersed using explosives. As an added bonus, anthrax was treatable using penicillin, which, unlike the Germans, the Allies would soon have in great supply. But the same properties which made anthrax so easy to weaponize also made it extremely persistent, a fact British scientists would soon learn the hard way. In 1942, the war was going badly for the Allies. The British Army was shut out of mainland Europe, U-boats were sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping off the coast of the United States, the Eighth Army was being pushed out of North Africa, and German forces were advancing ever deeper into the Soviet Union. About the only weapons the Allies had to strike back against the Axis were the bombers of the Royal Air Force, and to maximize their destructive power, the British began planning a massive biological warfare campaign against Nazi Germany. Codename Operation Vegetarian, the plan called for RAF bombers to drop millions of anthrax-infected feed cakes across Germany. These would be eaten by cattle and other livestock, contaminating their meat and causing widespread disease and famine. The resulting disruption of civilian life was expected to cause Nazi Germany to collapse within months. To test this weapon, scientists at the Biological Warfare Center at Porton Down acquired the remote island of Groonyard in northern Scotland. A flock of sheep was transported to the island, and various designs of anthrax bombs and anthrax cake dispensers were exploded among them. The effects were chilling. Within 3 days, every single sheep was dead. The contaminating corpses were buried by piling them under a cliff and dynamiting the cliff on top of them. But a single corpse managed to float away and washed ashore on the mainland. This touched off an anthrax outbreak that killed over 100 livestock and pets. Thankfully, the Porton Down scientists were able to contain the outbreak before it spread to the human population. Though due to wartime secrecy, it would be decades before the locals discovered just what had killed their animals. But Groonyard Island was found to be hopelessly contaminated, and after disinfecting the soil as best they could with fire and formaldehyde, the scientists suspended all further experiments and sealed the island off indefinitely. The Groonyard Island incident convinced the government that it was too dangerous to manufacture and test biological weapons on British soil. For an alternate site, they turned to their colony across the Atlantic. It would not be the first or last time Britain looked to Canada to help test dangerous weapons. Following a series of experiments at Porton Down where British soldiers were exposed to mustard gas, Britain ordered all further testing moved to Suffield, a Canadian military base in Alberta. Here, in May of 1942, 712 volunteer Canadian soldiers were marched out onto the proving grounds wearing only gas masks and regular combat gear and ordered to stand at attention while aircraft flying at 1,000 feet sprayed them with mustard gas. Once the gas had fully penetrated their clothing, they were marched back to the base and the effects studied. If you're unfamiliar, mustard gas is a vesicant or blister agent which, when absorbed by the skin, inflicts severe, extremely painful chemical burns that can take months to heal. Participants were paid $1 for volunteering and $20 for each burn that appeared, though given the horrific effects, it is debatable whether these rewards were worth it for any of them. Similar experiments were later carried out on troops in Innisfail, Australia, and Karachi, British India, making Britain and her empire the only belligerent nation other than Japan to test chemical weapons on human subjects during World War II. Incredibly, in 1950, Canada would offer to allow Britain to test its first atomic bomb in the Canadian North near the town of Churchill, an offer Britain declined in favor of Australia. Meanwhile, in the months following Sir Frederick Banting's death, biological weapons research in Canada began to languish. Then, in October of 1941, U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson sent a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt urging the creation of a U.S. bioweapons program. Due to the more advanced state of the Canadian program, an agreement was reached whereby the U.S. would bankroll Canadian development of bioweapons until their own development center at Fort Detrick, Maryland was up and running. This coincided almost perfectly with the British request for an alternate weapons development center, and with $200,000 of U.S. government funds in hand, project directors E.J.D. Murray and Otto Mass began searching for a suitable site for a secret bioweapons lab. They quickly found one in the former quarantine station at Grosse Ile, a place with an already dark and tragic past. Grosse Ile Station was established in 1832, replacing the older Point Levy Station. And just in time, too, for in the late 1840s, Canada was inundated with hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Potato Famine. Many of these immigrants arrived aboard so-called coffin ships, lumber freighters offering cheap transatlantic passage, and the crowded, unsanitary conditions in their holds led to frequent outbreaks of disease like typhus and cholera. In 1847 alone, more than 100,000 people arrived in Quebec, with up to 40 ships lining up for 3 kilometers over the river waiting to unload their cargoes. This massive influx quickly overwhelmed the island's limited facilities. Its hospitals were soon filled to bursting, forcing many of the sick to fend for themselves in the mud outside. Eventually, 22 150-foot-long fever sheds were built on the mainland to accommodate the overflow, but this led to disease spreading to the rest of the city. When the local population rioted, threatening to push the sheds into the river, the military were forced to cordon off the area. It would not be until 1854 that improved sanitation and a reduction in immigration finally brought an end to the epidemics. Between 1832 and 1932, around 500,000 immigrants entered Canada via Grosse Ile, making it, along with Pier 21 in Halifax, the Canadian analog of Ellis Island in New York. Of these new arrivals, around 5,000 died of diseases, their bodies buried in mass graves on the island itself and on the nearby Point Charles. The island was an ideal site for bacteriological research for several reasons. First, it was remote and relatively inaccessible, the closest population center being the small village of Montmagny just across the river. Second, it was entirely self-sufficient with its own working power plant, boilers, dormitories, churches, and hospitals. But most attractive of all was the decontamination building, which featured a pair of massive steam-powered sterilization chambers. Immigrants arriving on Grosse Ile were required to remove their clothes and place them in ovens before proceeding to the showers, on the other side of which they would collect their newly lice and flea-free clothes. These chambers, thought Murray and Mass, would be ideal for growing large quantities of anthrax. But some weren't so sure. Charles Mitchell, Canada's chief veterinarian, objected that the island wasn't isolated enough, being only 6 kilometers from the nearest riverbank. To be sufficiently safe, he argued that the site would have to be at least 80 kilometers offshore. But as no alternative site could be found, Mitchell was overruled, and in 1942, the Grosse Ile Laboratory commenced operation under the cover name War Disease Control Station. The island, under the command of Major Richard Duthie and guarded by a garrison of 100 soldiers, was divided into 2 main areas. The west of the island was occupied by Project R, studying rinderpest, and the east end by Project N, studying anthrax. Anthrax was grown in flat trays and 2 decontamination ovens, which for safety reasons were kept locked shut with the scientists inside. Many scientists found working in the ovens in full protective gear unbearable, leading many to adopt the curious practice of working naked except for a gas mask. This practice also had the added benefit of making their bodies easier to decontaminate, but even measures such as these soon proved grossly inadequate. In an early report on Grosse Ile's operation, Major Duthie complained that the island was infested with flies, which could easily land on lab equipment and carry deadly spores to the mainland. Then, in August 1943, several scientists came down with mysterious illnesses and had to be isolated at a hospital in Quebec City. Tests later confirmed they were infected with anthrax. The incident raised alarm bells among the project directors, many of whom called for the island laboratory to be shut down. But they were ultimately overruled for political reasons, as many in the project wanted to prove that Canadian scientists were every bit as good as their American counterparts. And there were other dangers to worry about. In the fall of 1943, German U-boats began penetrating deeper and deeper into St. Lawrence estuary, raising fears that they would discover the Grosse Ile station. Isolation also began to take its toll. Due to the top-secret nature of the project, the island garrison were unable to bring their families along. Bored and restless, they acted abysmally while on leave. This led to concerns about the island's secrets leaking out, though by this time the residents of Montmagny already suspected something was amiss and began avoiding the island staff like the plague. Yet despite these difficulties, anthrax production forged ahead, and by the end of 1943, Gross Eel was producing 120 kilograms of anthrax spores every single week, enough to fill 1,500 standard aerial bombs. In August of 1944, these bombs were extensively tested at the Suffield Proving Grounds, despite the fact that unlike Grunyard Island, Suffield had no natural geographical barriers to prevent deadly spores from drifting into populated areas. The extent of the site's contamination remains classified to this day, a somewhat alarming fact given that anthrax spores can survive in the soil for up to 100 years. In any case, the British were impressed with the results and ordered 500,000 anthrax bombs from Suffield and Gross Eel. But while the scientists perfected their deadly creations, Allied leaders dithered on how or whether to use them. Despite the Grunyard fiasco, planning for Operation Vegetarian continued, though it was only to be carried out in retaliation for a German anthrax attack on Britain. Then, on the eve of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe in 1944, a new plan was proposed to drop anthrax and rinderpest on various German cities, including Hamburg and Berlin. But this too was shelved for fear of reprisals and reserved only as a retaliatory measure. At the same time, Allied intelligence began to learn of two advanced secret weapons being developed by the Germans, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile. Both had the range to reach London from launch sites in occupied France and the Netherlands, but only had an accuracy of about 8 kilometers and a payload of 1 ton. This would make an explosive or chemical warhead all but useless, leaving only one possible payload, a biological weapon. In response, Allied scientists began producing large quantities of botulinum toxin, better known as Botox, a poison so potent that 1 gram can kill 1 million people. As with anthrax, this choice was predicated on the fact that the Allies had Botox antidote and the Germans did not. But in the end, all these plans came to nothing as attacks using conventional weapons finally forced Nazi Germany to surrender on May 8, 1945. And when the conquering armies inspected Nazi battle preparations, they were shocked by what they found. Despite Allied fears, in reality, Germany had no biological weapons program to speak of. And while German scientists had developed the deadly nerve gases, sarin and tabun, military leaders had opted not to use them for fear of Allied reprisals. Even the vaunted V weapons carried only high explosives and not biological warheads as many had feared. For all the paranoia which had driven the Allied WMD programs, even the Nazis found the prospect of chemical and biological warfare too terrible to contemplate. But even if the Allies had opted to use biological weapons, Canada would only have been a small part of the overall effort. Of the 500,000 bombs ordered by Britain, only 5,000 were produced by Gross Eel and Suffield by the war's end. Still, this alone accounted for 439 liters of spores, or 70 billion lethal doses, enough to kill the world population at the time 30 times over. But by 1944, anthrax production at Fort Detrick was in full swing and quickly eclipsed the Canadian facilities, causing the United States to break off its partnership with Canada. Research at Gross Eel continued until 1956, when the station was finally shut down and decommissioned. In 1957, it became a veterinary research center, while in 1965 it was once again used as a quarantine station, though this time for imported animals. But the story doesn't quite end there. You see, on March 24, 1970, George Ignatieff, ambassador to the United Nations Conference of the Committee on Disarmament, delivered a speech in which he claimed Canada never has and does not now possess any biological weapons or toxins. It was a bold-faced lie, as declassified government documents would reveal just 2 years later. While the Canadian government's official story was that chemical and biological weapons research had ended with the Second World War, in reality it had quietly continued for decades afterwards. In 1951 and 1952, extensive tests with sarin nerve gas were conducted at Suffield, while between 1962 and 1973, Canada participated in Project 112, a U.S. Department of Defense program wherein simulated biological agents were sprayed over American and Canadian cities. Meanwhile, Suffield amassed massive stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, including 637 tons of mustard gas, 30 tons of sarin and VX nerve gas, 200 tons of phosgene, 2,800 pounds of botulinum toxin, and 200 pounds of ricin, the majority of which was not disposed of until 1989. 1974 brought to light another dangerous legacy of Canada's biowarfare project. In that year, the federal government, unaware of the island's secret wartime role, designated Grosse Ile a National Historic Site and began developing it for tourism. In 1988, after thousands of tourists had already visited the island, the story of its use as an anthrax factory finally broke. And while scientists working at the station in 1956 claimed to have thoroughly decontaminated the island with formaldehyde, no records could be found confirming this fact. Worse still, some sources indicated that the anthrax-growing trays had simply been tossed into the St. Lawrence or even into the bushes, meaning that the entire island might be contaminated with deadly spores. Acting quickly, government closed the site and passed it over to Environment Canada, who thoroughly decontaminated the site before handing it back to Parks Canada. In the end, no known person has contracted anthrax from visiting the island. Many of the details of Grosse Ile and Canada's bioweapons program may never be known, for most of the archive records were accidentally lost in the early 1990s. But what is known remains a dark and disturbing chapter in Canada's history, one that runs counter to the popular image of the nation. But it is perhaps also a cause for hope, for despite the cruelty and depravity that characterized the deadliest conflict in modern history, most of the belligerent nations were wise enough to know that biological warfare was a horror too far, even for a group like the Nazis. 2023 marks the 100-year anniversary of an event so tragic and calamitous that it changed world history to a frightening degree, helping to push Japan into World War II. So what happened? Since the 17th century, the island nation of Japan had pursued a policy of seclusion, severely limiting foreign contact in an effort to preserve its traditions and identity. This policy was forcibly challenged in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry, acting under direct orders from American President Millard Fillmore, sailed an armed fleet into Uraga near the entrance to Japan's Edo Bay and, by a mixture of threats and diplomacy, demanded access. The impetus for Perry's mission was partly the need to secure increasing American commerce in the area, including things like large numbers of whaling ships off Japan's coast. There was also growing pressure resulting from European nations' increasing monopolization of Asian coal fields. In short, the US did not want to be left behind. On top of this, for some time up to this point, shipwrecked foreign sailors who found themselves landing in Japan were either executed or imprisoned. Perry was under orders to secure the release of anyone in the latter category. Further, like many a colonial power before them, America believed it had both a mission and a right to bring modernity and Christianity to perceived so-called backward nations. And so it was that Perry set sail and, fortuitously, at the same time of his arrival, Tokugawa Ieyasu, Japan's ruling shogun, was incapacitated through illness. The resultant government indecision, together with the presence of formidable American firepower, led to the fateful decision. Perry was allowed to land at Kurihama. This period is often referred to as the opening of Japan. For better or worse, the country would never be the same again. Fast forward to 1923 and we find a country at a crossroads. The port city of Yokohama, founded in 1859 as Japan's first foreign settlement, had grown to a cosmopolitan area of 500,000 souls. Entrepreneurs, traders, spies, and adventurers from all over the world found themselves drawn to the famed meeting point between East and West. The Japanese writer Junichiro Tanesaka, who spent 2 years living in Yokohama, observed a cacophony of, to quote, florists, tailors, milliners, bakers, cafes, whatever decorates the windows, flowers, cakes, cloth, is a riot of loud Western color. It is generally agreed that the overwhelming spirit of the time was one of optimism. With the opening of its doors, Japan ushered in a new era of excitement and opportunity. There remained, however, a significant number of conservatives who resented and feared the growing Western influence. They were fighting against the tide, but the situation was finally balanced, and the stage was set for a cataclysmic chain of events. And so it was that on Saturday, September the 1st, 1923, at 11:58 a.m., an earthquake originating from a seismic fault 30 miles south of Tokyo struck Japan with a Richter scale measurement of 7.9. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, as it came to be known, struck Yokohama with devastating force, in the immediate toppling an astounding 80% of the buildings in the city. Ellis Zacharias, an assistant to the U.S. Naval Attaché, stood amongst the crowd gathered at the port to see off the luxury steamship Empress of Australia when the quake hit. He later described the scene as, "The smiles vanished, and for an appreciable instant everyone stood transfixed by the sound of unearthly thunder." Another surviving witness, American Otis Manchester Poole, who managed a trading firm, recalled, "Over everything had settled a thick white dust, and through the yellow fog of dust, still in the air, a copper-colored sun shone upon this silent havoc and sickly reality." On board the Empress of Australia, the ship's captain, Samuel Robinson, watched in mounting horror as the vessel shook all over in a most terrifying fashion, and also rocked very quickly and violently until it seemed as though the masts and funnels must carry away. 300 or 400 people were on the wharf when the earthquake happened. A number fell or were thrown by the motion down the fissures as they opened and closed as the land waves passed, either disappearing into the water below or being crushed to death. A dense pull of dust rose up hundreds of feet above the town, and a terrible roar came from it. The ship under Robinson's command subsequently rescued hundreds of survivors and worked tirelessly to deliver vital supplies of fresh water. Another fortunate survivor, ironically life insurance salesman W.D. Cameron, recounted his experience. To stand or walk was a physical impossibility. Those who did not crouch in terror the instant the shock began were thrown violently to the ground. Earth split and cracked in all directions, oozing water from some of the deeper fissures. Worse was to come. Because the earthquake hit when many people were preparing meals, flames from stoves, together with ruptured glass pipes, quickly resulted in rampaging fires, which spread uncontrollably throughout the primarily wooden dwellings, transforming the once bustling Yokohama into a cauldron of heat and smoke. High winds, which buffeted the country at the time, due to a typhoon off the coast of the Noto Peninsula, exacerbated the problem. Magazine editor Henry W. Kinney was struck by the sheer devastation. Yokohama, the city of almost 500,000 souls, had become a vast plain of fire. Here and there, a remnant of a building, a few shattered walls, stood up like rocks above the expanse of flame, unrecognizable. For the city was gone. Further damage and terrible loss of life resulted from a 10-meter-high tsunami which hit within minutes. As Kinney further noted, "I saw a 30-foot boat that had been lifted neatly on top of the roof of a prostrated house. Vast portions of the hills facing the ocean had slid into the sea." By the time the shockwave reached Tokyo, its power diminished considerably, but the effect was still terrible. Although only a small fraction of the buildings in the city collapsed due to the tremors, as with Yokohama, deadly fires spread at terrifying speed, eventually destroying 45% of the city. Firestorms raged, with many people dying as their feet became stuck in melting tarmac. One survivor recounted the ordeal. "We ran through cyclones of intense heat towards a school under construction. I watched flames shoot out from futons that people had slung over their backs. As hot as it was, a girl tried to bury herself into the sand. Before she died, she murmured, 'I'm so hot, please give me water,' but I had none to give her." In Rikugan Hanjo Hifukusho, formerly an army depot, around 38,000 people had taken shelter, only to be engulfed by flames. Near the Sumida River, where 44,000 had gathered, another horrifying natural phenomenon manifested. Fire tornadoes are a relatively rare occurrence. Composed of flame and hot ash, they form when intense rising heat and sheer winds blowing strongly in different directions over a small area, meet, combining into a whirling, flaming vortex. As the air inside the vortex rushes upward, matter from surrounding environment is sucked inside, including debris and combustible gases. Once created, fire tornadoes are notoriously difficult to contain. Incredibly, as Neil Lauro, professor and atmospheric scientist at the University of Nevada, notes, such a tornado initiates its own weather system, helping to concentrate the rotation. In the case of the Great Kanto earthquake, the fire tornado which formed near the Sumida River soared to a dizzying height of 91 meters. Of the 44,000 people who had sought sanctuary in the area, only 300 survived. It was a full 3 days before the last of the fires died down, by which time nearly half of Tokyo had burned into nothing. All told, the Kanto earthquake, together with a subsequent tsunami and raging fires, accounted for 140,000 deaths and virtually demolished 2 major cities. The damage, however, wasn't confined to Tokyo and Yokohama. In the mountainous region of the western Kanagawa prefecture, hundreds were swept away by landslides, while in the village of Nabukawa, an entire village, together with 100 passengers aboard a train, were carried into the sea. Sadly, however, further terrors were about to ensue. Before we get into that, it's helpful to review a little more Japanese history. In 1910, following a long period of warfare and political pressure, Japan invaded Korea. For reference, Korea did not split into North and South until 1945. Japan's reign was far from benign. In order to completely subjugate its new subjects, Korean culture was attacked on a massive scale. Students were forbidden from speaking Korean, Japanese became the enforced national language, and 20,000 Korean historical documents were destroyed. 100,000 Japanese families settled in the new land, and 725,000 Koreans were sent the other way, forced to work in mainland Japan and its colonies. Thousands of Korean women were also inducted into military brothels, and the Korean royal palace was largely destroyed. Religion, too, was strictly controlled, with the natives made to worship the gods of Imperial Japan. During the immediate aftermath of the Kanto earthquake, an atmosphere of fear and distrust boiled over. Rumors spread just as swiftly as the flames, carrying tales of Korean immigrants poisoning water supplies, possessing bombs, and plotting to take advantage of the chaos to overthrow the Japanese government. Whilst untrue, the perceived threat rattled the already de-established population, and so it was that bands of Japanese scoured the ruins in search of Koreans and massacred them whenever they were discovered. Estimates put the ensuing death toll at between 6,000 and 8,000 people. Crucially, amidst the turmoil, authorities took the opportunity to crack down on left-wing political dissidents. In the aftermath post-disaster, Tokyo was a scene of desolation. Of 2.26 million citizens, 1.38 million were declared homeless, 781,000 in Yokohama alone. The destruction affected every part of society, and the economic damage was considerable. 7,000 factories were destroyed, together with a large number of banking offices. The area's already inadequate social services provisions were decimated. 33.4 million square meters of Tokyo had been blasted out of existence. Martial law was swiftly declared, and Army and Navy personnel worked round the clock to repair infrastructure and deliver food, water, and medical aid. By the 24th of September, temporary housing had been erected for 150,000 refugees. One foreign correspondent surmised that it may take decades for Tokyo to rise from the ashes to its former prosperity and importance. General Yamanashi, in charge of the relief, observed that it took 10 days to restore some sort of order and calm in the region. International help led by the United States was not long in arriving. President Calvin Coolidge oversaw the dispatch of dozens of warships carrying food, gasoline, and bedding. Tragically, the mood of mutual goodwill was not to last long. Many Japanese expressed resentment toward the need for Western help, with the U.S. in return labeling Japan as ungrateful. Then came a significant turning point. In the following days, leading Japanese figures interpreted the Kanto quake as a rebuke and a warning. As scholar J. Charles Schenking writes, many Japanese elites, including bureaucrats and politicians, religious leaders, social commentators, and journalists, publicly described the earthquake as divine punishment. They sought to strengthen the legitimacy of their previously expressed concerns about and displeasure with what they saw in 1920s urban Japan, namely decadence, selfishness, extravagance, frivolity, individualism, and pursuit of luxury. In essence, these commentators believed, or at least stated, that the quake had been sent from the gods to penalize Japan for allowing itself to be seduced by immoral Western lifestyles and values. The optimistic outward-looking period symbolized by Yokohama appeared to be over. As Schenking further observes, the disaster nurtured a strong sense that Japan possessed an unparalleled opportunity not only to rebuild Tokyo, but also to reconstruct the nation and its people. The 1923 calamity fostered a culture of catastrophe and reconstruction that amplified discourses of moral degeneracy and national renovation. Kenneth Pyle of the University of Washington concurs that conservative element, already dismayed by the drift towards democracy, viewed the disaster as both a sign and an opportunity to reset society. Pyle states, after the earthquake, there's a measurable increase in right-wing patriotic groups in Japan that are really the groundwork of what is called Japanese fascism. Throughout human history, national disasters have often been used by those in power, or those who desire power, as an opportunity to promote change. In the case of the Great Kanto earthquake, discussion is still ongoing regarding the extent to which the disaster swayed public opinion and political direction. It is inarguable, though, that the quake occurred at a pivotal moment in Japan's history, when the country was struggling to choose between a definitive path between complete acceptance of Western democracy and continued military expansion. Following the events of the 1st September 1923, Japan veered sharply towards the latter. Just 18 years later, this all culminated in the country entering World War II as an Axis power, fighting alongside Nazi Germany and the Kingdom of Italy, leading up to December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor dragged America into the global conflict. Ellis Zacharias, who had witnessed the Kanto quake firsthand from the wharf in Yokohama, was by then in command of his own battleship and would go on to see active combat during the conflict. On the 6th of August, 4 years later, the United States deployed the world's first atomic bomb. 80,000 lives were lost in Hiroshima, with thousands more dying from radiation exposure. The age of the Cold War had begun. Were it not for a natural disaster 2 decades earlier, history may just have taken an altogether different course.